CBS News presidential inauguration coverage continues. From Capitol Hill, here again is Dan Rather.
And good morning again. It's 10 a.m. in the east and rainy, threatening to snow Washington, D.C. The transfer of power from Bill Clinton to George Bush is now just 2 hours away. Mr. Bush will be sworn in at noon Eastern Time, back there at the U.S. Capitol as the 43rd President of these United States. Right now, he is in church with his family. A short time ago, the President-elect and Mrs. Bush, with their twin daughters, left Blair House, where they spent the night, and headed over to St. John's Episcopal Church. A morning prayer service for incoming presidents has become an Inauguration Day tradition. You can't be here on a day like this, whether it's carried here by television or being here in person, and not feel the essence of this American ritual, which is, in Lincoln's famous phrase, of the people, by the people, and for the people. Russ Mitchell is out among some people as the U.S. Marine Band prepares to play. Russ, what do you hear the people talking about down there?
Well, the people are saying they're happy to be here today because they want to hear what George Bush has to say. They want him to talk about unity, et cetera, and they really wanted to come here today. Let me give you an idea of just how muddy it is. It is nasty out here. This is like the Red Sea out here parting the crowd. However, there are people here who aren't exactly Bush supporters. This young man is 17 years old, a high school student from Silver Spring, Maryland. He's got a Gore Lieberman button on. Did anybody tell you the election's over? Why are you here today with that on?
You got to support the Democratic Party.
What do you like? What would you like to hear? Is there anything George Bush could say today to make you happy?
I just want to see how he's going to unite the country. He's had so many plans, and Al Gore has so many things to say. I just want to see how he's going to unite the nation. We'll see what he does in the next 4 years.
Okay. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Before we start a riot here, we should, for equal time here, walk over to this nice lady right here who's from North Carolina. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. I'm great. I hope you are.
I'm doing just fine. Let me ask you the same question. What would you like to hear George Bush say today?
Well, that's the same thing C-SPAN just asked me. I think that he's going to unite this country like we have never seen before. And I think he's the only man that could do it. And I'm looking forward to that. It's a great day.
C-SPAN didn't ask it in such an eloquent way, right?
No, you're very much more eloquent.
Thank you very much.
But you don't have a yellow school bus.
Okay. I'm not sure what that meant. Dan, back to you.
Thanks, Russ. Tell the lady we like her hat a whole lot better than that thing Phil Jones had on here a while back.
Dan, we should add that we will not hold it against Russ Mitchell that he got scooped by C-SPAN. Now, we won't do that.
Definitely will not. So. You know, we had a picture of the band beginning to play on the front steps of the Capitol. I wonder if we could go back to that picture. We're going to do some other business and just pick up a little of the music, because music is so important to this day. Let's just listen for a moment or two. Well, under the baton of Colonel Timothy W. Foley, the 26th director of the President's Own, the U.S. Marine Band. Little musical interlude there. And now let's go to Bill Plant, our veteran White House correspondent who's at the White House today. Bill, what's going on at the White House at this moment?
Dan, it's absolutely extraordinary. Here we are about 20 minutes away from the time when the president-elect will come for a social call on the outgoing president. And President Clinton still has not issued that list of what we understand is over 100 pardons that we've been waiting for a couple of days now. It may include some famous names. It may include the name of Michael Milken. It may include some of his friends from Arkansas, like Webster Hubbell and Susan McDougal. But we don't know yet. We're still waiting. And Bill Clinton, on his last moments in office, issued another one of those federal proclamations setting aside a national monument. This one, Governor's Island in New York. So he's still busy. He was in the Oval Office just a few minutes ago, packing up his last things and presumably leaving a note for George W. Bush. But the West Wing is a very strange place on this morning as power prepares to transfer. There are no pictures on the walls. The furniture is all labeled with masking tape, has letters and numbers on it. It'll all be moved around in that space of a few hours between the departure of this staff and the arrival of the new one. It's an extraordinary moment in history, Dan.
Bill Plant, thanks. Bill Plant standing just outside the White House West Wing, here from just in front of the West Front of the U.S. Capitol. Time for me to say our CBS News coverage of the inauguration will continue after these messages. President Bill Clinton has been busy this morning. He's issued, we're now told, something like 100 pardons for various Americans, and also has created yet another national monument, this one on Governor's Island outside New York. This is a big story nationally and especially big in the Northeast. Let's go back to Bill Plant. Bill, first about the pardons.
Well, Dan, we have some interesting names on the pardon list. The president has pardoned, among other people, the former head of Housing and Urban Development, Henry Cisneros. He has pardoned Susan McDougal, the woman who refused to testify to Kenneth Starr and served 21 months in prison because she wouldn't talk. He has pardoned Patty Hearst, the heiress who became part of something called the Symbionese Liberation Army back in the 70s and robbed a bank. He has not pardoned, I say not pardoned, Michael Milken or Jonathan Pollard. He has not pardoned his old associate, Webster Hubbell, who was a law partner of Hillary Clinton. We thought he might do that. There are over 100 pardon names on this list, and so far the best known are Susan McDougal, Patty Hearst, and Henry Cisneros. Dan?
Bill Plant. Bill, what about the creation of the monument on Governor's Island, New York?
Also, Dan, we understand that Roger Clinton is on that list, the president's brother. As for the national monument on Governor's Island, that's one of a series that he's done, and all of these that he has announced within the last week will be blocked by the blocking of publication in the Federal Register, something that President-elect Bush is expected to do as soon as he becomes president. So that may or may not happen, Dan.
A lot of news happening here, including that the Bushes are now beginning to leave St. John's Church. You can see some umbrellas in the crowd. A church service. And let's listen as the bells ring. And as the bells toll, and the officials of St. John's Church greet those in attendance, the president-elect and his family have not yet emerged. You see James Baker, the former Secretary of State, who was so important. See him just now moving into frame out of the pillars, followed by Jack Kemp. James Baker was so important to the presidency of George Bush the elder, and who, by any reasonable analysis, saved the George W. Bush campaign in Florida with his legal maneuvers and staunch defense of the Bush candidacy in Florida at the critical time. Jack Kemp and others, the former Housing and Urban Development Secretary, former Congressman upstate New York, former great quarterback for Buffalo Bills and San Diego Chargers is there. Former Senator Alan Simpson and other dignitaries, all in attendance this morning. Former President Bush and former President Reagan worshipped at St. John's on Inauguration Day. President Clinton, on his Inauguration Day, was at the Metropolitan AME Church here in Washington, D.C., and Jimmy Carter was at the First Baptist Church here. The sounds mingling in the background, telling you much about modern 21st century America. Sirens in the distance as the bells toll, and in the far distance the U.S. Marine Band playing What Else, Susan?
You know, the interesting things, Dan, about Bill Clinton going to an AME church, the African Methodist Episcopalian Church. That was known as the Freedom Church. Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass were all part of that, Rosa Parks. And for a Southerner coming in when he was inaugurated and going to an all-black church congregation like that, I think told us something early about his legacy that we see now, that if he gets high marks anywhere in this country, it's with African Americans who really seem to have connected to him a great deal.
Well, one doesn't want to read too much in this as we wait for the Bushes to come out, but if you read in the symbolism of President-elect, soon-to-be President George W. Bush going to St. John's Church on this day, it was as his father did when he came in to the presidency. And George W. Bush has made no doubt about it. He intends to be his own man. He intends to run his own presidency, but he will be guided, he is honest himself, by the experiences of his father when his father was president of these United States. By the way, for those of you who have not been in Washington, Lafayette Square, which is directly across from the White House, and which at one corner of which this church is across from, it's one of the prettier sights in this capital, always has been for me. And you can hear the band in the distance. Can you there? Let's hear just a little bit of it. As the bells fade, the band plays. What we were saying as we come back from that brief musical interlude, that the great avenue, Pennsylvania Avenue, that runs in front of the White House is now blocked off in this area, between Lafayette Square and the White House. And there is some controversy about it. Outgoing Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, for example, says, look, it's too much security. They blocked off this after the Oklahoma City bombing. They blocked it off for security reasons. And there is a possibility that the new president, George Bush, will decide, for symbolic reasons as well as others, to open it up. But you can bet he will not do that until after he has consulted very carefully with the Secret Service and others responsible for security. Because after all, the country is in a new era. The era, unfortunately, that is, among other things, the era of terrorism.
Well, this all happened, this was closed off, Dan, after the bombing in Oklahoma City, and it is the Secret Service that wants it closed. There are two objections. People say, number one, symbolically, our national shrines should not be barricaded off where the American people can't see them. The second reason is it has tied up Washington traffic in a way that it has never been tied up before. So downtown merchants also want and are urging very strongly that this street be reopened.
Well, there's so many decisions that the new president has to make. One would think that would be pretty far down the line, but it's been in the local papers. Washington Post talked a lot about it, and it may very well be that there needs to be a national debate about whether it's more important to have in the land of the free and the home of the brave an open avenue right in front of the White House, or whether it's more important to take every security precaution, including blocking off that street. This is the first inauguration to be officially designated a, quote, national special security event. And that means that the Secret Service is in charge. Not the police department, not anybody else. The Secret Service is in charge. Over a dozen law enforcement agencies are involved in the inauguration security, including policemen brought in from such places as West Virginia and Pennsylvania to help out. But that would all be under the heading, before one makes too much of it, of what's prudent under today's circumstances. Security will not allow any stilts or giant puppets to the inaugural event. Agents feel the stilts could be used as clubs and people could hide weapons in giant puppets. Governor Pataki of New York greeting well-wishers outside St. John's Church. Police are setting up 16 security checkpoints for the inauguration, an unprecedented security measure being taken because so many, quote, disgruntled demonstrators are expected. Now, whether the weather and other factors keeping the numbers down, we don't, in fact, know at this moment. This will be the first, as you pointed out earlier, Bob, the first screened access inaugural parade in U.S. history. Oh, I love the music. Let's pick it up. Well, and if your foot can keep from tapping to music like that, then there's something wrong with you. The U.S. Marine Band providing the musical interlude, as it will be all interludes all morning long, and provide the music for the inaugurations itself. We're waiting for the Bush family to come out from St. John's Church. That'll be followed by the President-elect and his wife Laura going over to the White House for a meeting with the Clintons. So that's what's happening now as we let your eyes soak up these scenes. What a beautiful picture, the kind of thing that might have been painted by some impressionist. No, not French, have to be an American to do.
He wouldn't need much color, though. He just need a little gray and a little white and maybe just a dash of yellow every once in a while to show a car light. But this is very, well, there's some red, white, and blue, obviously, but a very, very gray day here in Washington, Dan. But this is inauguration weather. This is the way it most often is, at least in recent years.
When I was reading about some of the past inaugurals and about bands, one of the great concerns is the instruments freezing. And at least today, without it being too cold, it might be rainy, they can play. Ronald Reagan, during his 1985 inaugural, when they moved indoors, one of the big concerns with all these bands and the Marine Band, how can you play outside? The trumpet will get clogged up. You know, the brass instruments won't play, so I think we'll have music all day long today.
Well, I could listen to the band play all day long, and much rather do that than listen to us rattle on here. But in the nature of television, we'll try to mix the music. Oh, hopefully some information. It's hard to attend one of these things, I think impossible, and not have such a sense of history. It's often said of Americans that we are the youth of the world. Still, much of the world, particularly in Europe, and I would say in Asia as well, we're seen as the world's children because we're still, as they like to say, a very young country, although we are the world's oldest surviving country built on the principles of freedom and democracy, in fact, the world's oldest surviving constitutional republic. So in that sense, we're not all that young. But in terms of American history, a lot comes together on one of these inauguration days. We mentioned earlier the sense of unity, that American belief that united we stand, and put to the test this year, 2001, as it much more than on some other inauguration days. Yes, we had it in the inauguration of 1889 after a particularly close and bitter election in 1888. We had it in 1877 after an unbelievably close and hotly contested election in 1876. We had it again in 1825 after the election of 1824. We've had it before, but this is an unusual situation in which there were stresses and strains on our national unity in the sense of that belief that united we stand. But today there is this sense in Washington of a great coming together. Not going to kid anybody, Democrats are still bitter about what they consider to be a Supreme Court handing the election, quote unquote, to George Bush. And yes, there are those Republicans who, a few who do the equivalent of dancing in the end zone or hanging on the rim. But overall and in the main, Bob Schieffer, I think you'll agree, as we wait for the Bushes to come out of St. John's Church, that there's a spirit here. I hesitate to call it bipartisanship. I'd just like to call it an American spirit, as corny as that might strike some folks. Look, we had a tough election. That's behind us. We have a new president, and we go forward.
Well, it is, if nothing else, at least a break in the action. Our form of government is a partisan form of government. We have political parties, and that's kind of the way it is supposed to be, or the way it's been for most of the history of this republic. But on Inauguration Day, it is a time for both sides to say, look, let's put aside all the rancor of the campaign we've just come through. Let's enjoy this together, because we're going to have some tough fights coming up in the days to come. And that's exactly what we had. I mean, this was the most unusual election, certainly that I've ever seen and that I can recall in the history of this country. I think it has been a good time, and it has been a reason for people to, this year, put more stress on, let's just forget it for at least 24 hours and think about good things. And I think in a way that's the way it's been.
Sorry, Bob.
Well, when we saw earlier that one young man in the mall with the Gore Lieberman button on, I forgot all about Al Gore for about the last 2 or 3 weeks. And then today, looking in the newspapers, you don't really even see his name. And what a strange day this must be for the vice president, stepping down under these circumstances, sort of fading already into history, not even being written about in the papers. It's clearly a Bush-Clinton day.
Well, that's a good point, Doug Brinkley. And even those who don't like Al Gore and would never consider voting for him have said he's handled himself in a very classy manner, beginning with his concession speech.
And it is, and I don't mean that Bill Clinton has not been classy, I don't want to use that word, but it is very much in contrast to what we've seen from Bill Clinton. He has been on center stage from the day after the election and right up until yesterday, when he continued to dominate the news when we learned about this deal that means he won't be indicted. Bill Clinton's not going away. He's going to be living here, the first president since Woodrow Wilson, to do that, and we're going to be seeing a lot and hearing from him, I think, Dan.
Indeed, as the dignitaries file on to the reviewing stand and to the observation platform built outside the west wing, outside the west front of the White House, we keep making that mistake. Perhaps I can be forgiven as a former White House correspondent talking about the West Wing, which is in the White House. We're at the west front of the Capitol. We're awaiting the soon-to-be first family to emerge from St. John's Episcopal Church across from the White House on a foggy, rainy day in which they say we may have some snow tonight. Everybody hoping it'll at least hold off until tomorrow morning after the inaugural balls, but we'll just have to see about that. The presidential inauguration has never been held on a Sunday in this country. This is, by the way, a shot of the West Wing of the White House, and the limousines beginning to arrive. And we think this is former President Bush, George Bush the elder, but we're not certain we'll soon see. But we were saying that while one of the ongoing debates in this country is the relationship of government to religion, we do believe in separation of church and state. This is Vice President Al Gore arriving at the White House, and then a cutaway, what a shot, Vice President Gore arriving at the White House just as President-elect George W. Bush the Younger and his wife Laura emerged from St. John's Episcopal Church. President-elect waving with his now very recognizable first one hand and the other wave, but a solemn, appropriate solemn look on the young President-elect's face. And then right across the street, President Clinton greeting Vice President Gore as they go into the White House to await the Bush's arrival. As we mentioned earlier, they'll meet inside, and President Clinton with soon-to-be President Bush will have some little private social time inside. And
it's the first time we've had a United States Senator in that meeting, Dan. Hillary Clinton.
True enough, good point. That Mrs. Clinton, Hillary Rodham Clinton, will be in there. First time we had a senator in that meeting of an outgoing president and the incoming president in the White House as the transfer of power is made. I'm not sure that this is absolutely confirmed, but the plan is for the First Lady, Mrs. Clinton, to accompany soon-to-be former President Clinton to New York this afternoon, rather than stay in Washington and vote on the confirmation hearings. The confirmation hearings are finishing for some of these cabinet nominees and designates of the Bush administration. Bob Schieffer, check me if this is correct. Those confirmations will be by voice vote.
They will.
And so the Hillary Clinton feels that she can go to New York. There'll be a celebration in New York, a welcome to New York that Clinton's held as the inauguration festivities go on here.
You know, Dan, there was a funny little joke going around Washington. The president, the outgoing president, after, you know, the ceremony and so forth, always goes out to Andrews Air Force Base and gets on Air Force One and then flies off to where he was going. The joke was that the president former President Clinton and Mrs. Clinton would go out to Andrews, get off on Air Force One, and then fly to Reagan National Airport here in Washington, because that's where they were going to be living. Well, in fact, they're going to fly on up to New York, where they have a home also. But it's going to be very different having a former president who's married to a United States senator living in Washington at the same time someone else is in the White House.
This is the Bush motorcade. The new, soon-to-be first family, traveling this motorcade from St. John's Church, a short distance over to the White House. The Bushes should be pretty much on time at the White House. As you may recall, the Clintons were almost half an hour late. The coffee with George Bush Sr. in 1993. Their church service ran longer than this one and was a little bit farther away.
What we came to know as Clinton time, you'll remember, Dan, the Clintons were never famous for getting places on time. Those of us who waited for them to make speeches on national television and had to fill from time to time know that all too well.
But in fairness to the Clintons, it's more or less presidential time. Presidents and presidents-elect have a great difficulty staying on time because they have such tight schedules. Look at this shot, a high shot. You saw that looking onto the White House grounds. Perhaps we can get that shot back in a moment. This is inside the White House as the Clintons and the Gores await the arrival of the incoming president, his family, and his entourage in his motorcade.
I've been doing some research today, and when you see those big limousines at the Henry Ford Museum and Library, and they have a display on presidential cars, and it's extraordinary to see how those are virtual tanks you're seeing driving there with, you know, plate glass window and armor that you can't believe. And at the Henry Ford Museum, they have the car that Kennedy was assassinated on and other such vehicles.
And now what's called in television the money shot. President-elect Mrs. Bush.
House of Representatives of the United States.
Mrs. Clinton, Senator Clinton, dropping back to take Laura Bush gently by the arm, escort her in. President Clinton making talk, which we assume to be small talk, with the president-elect.
Well, you know, Dan, whatever else you want to say about Bill Clinton, he can make the most of any situation. I mean, he is the master of small talk, as you say, and large talk. I think even those who don't like him would say he's one of the most charming politicians, certainly that I've seen or dealt with over the years. And I think even the most harsh Republican critics would agree to that. They also think he's one of the best politicians ever. So he'll do well during this meeting. And George Bush, genial fellow that he is, this will probably be, in my view, a much gentler kind of meeting than some in the past.
Second money shot. Vice President Al Gore and his wife Tipper. Greeting the Cheneys, the incoming vice presidential couple. Dick Cheney, the vice president-elect, no stranger to the White House. He was White House chief of staff in the latter stages of the Ford administration, and the epitome of a Washington insider, although, especially as a Republican, he would not like to be described as such. But in a complimentary way, he knows the territory, including the inside of the White House, where he worked for quite a while before he became Chief of White House Staff. He was assistant to Chief of White House Staff Don Rumsfeld before Rumsfeld moved over to defense. So they're all inside now, headed for the Blue Room, always used as a reception room in the White House, and we'll be telling you more about that As you look at this shot from high above the west wing of the White House, we're going to take a slight break, but we'll be right back, so stick in here with us. The Clintons and the Gores, the Bushes and the Cheneys are inside the White House now, inside the beautiful blue room, one of Jacqueline Kennedy's favorite rooms in the White House, having coffee. As they talk, make small talk, and perhaps, who knows, perhaps big talk between outgoing President Clinton and incoming President Bush a little later on, we ask the rhetorical question, what's on the President-elect's mind as he heads to his inauguration? Well, he talked with Jane Clayson of the CBS Early Show, and Jane is here with me again. Jane, what do you have to say?
Dan, good morning. As he prepared for what is sure to be the biggest day of his life, George W. Bush took a quick break yesterday to spend a few moments telling me how he will approach this most historic moment.
I am going to absorb all of it. I want to take it all in. Sun, rain, or snow. I'm looking forward to it. I have got a statement I want to make to the country. It's an important part of any administration. At the beginning is the inauguration, the inaugural speech. And I've got a good one to give, I think.
And what do you want to say?
Well, I want to talk about how optimistic I am about America, what a wonderful country this is. I'm also going to say that some people don't really see the American dream as meant for them.
Are you going to be able to look at your dad without crying?
Yes. It's going to be emotional. It's emotional. It's got to be emotional. But I want you to know what I think about him. I think this moment defines him and Mother as much as anything else. It shows the power of unconditional love. Whether it's my brother's inauguration or my inauguration, the fact that these two good folks have got a son who's the president and another son who's the governor of the state of Florida really talks about how wonderful of parents they were.
Everything that's gone on with John Ashcroft in the last few days.
That you failed to even offer an alternative.
The partisan sniping, did you expect it? Does
Yes.
it worry you as someone who campaigned on the issue of being a uniter, not a divider? Are we off to the wrong start?
Oh, not at all. I think that first, John Ashcroft will be confirmed. Secondly, he's going to be a really good Attorney General because he's going to enforce the law.
He also talked about Roe v. Wade, and he said the agenda of your administration is not to overturn Roe v. Wade.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true?
Well, I think what he's referring to is spending political capital on the Hill trying to get a constitutional amendment through, which is not right. We can't get it done. It's not going to happen. Secondly, I understand people are going to disagree on abortion. And what my agenda will be is to try to reduce abortions. There's going to be abortion in America. And the fundamental question is, are they going to be safe? Will they be numerous or not? You know, will we learn to value and respect life? And that's one of the things I intend to do, is to work on the culture that respects life.
Upholding Roe v. Wade?
Yeah, that's the law. And that's exactly what the Attorney General will do.
I read you're practicing up on your box step.
Well, I'd like to try. I'd like to show it here. We could maybe do a little practice ourselves on national TV, but I'm afraid I'm too clumsy right now. I've got a couple more lessons to do. I'm not much of a dancer, but I'm going to dance. And I'm going to dance not one time, but I guess 8 times Saturday night.
He may not be dancing for some time as he plans to get to work immediately on an announcement on education reform expected this week. Dan.
Well, he's smart enough to know, dance the dance you know. What a
That's
good
right.
interview, Jane. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan.
And our CBS News coverage of the inauguration will continue with some great pictures inside the White House coming up.
CBS News presidential inauguration coverage will continue.
Back now for CBS News coverage of the inauguration of the 43rd President of the United States. The 43rd President-to-be, George Bush, is inside the White House at the moment. He's in the Blue Room. He, Mrs. Bush, the Clintons, the Gores. Now, for those of us, the White House, the Blue Room is, as you look toward it, just off to the left there and deep in the interior. To the extreme left would be the East Room itself. And then leading out of the East Room, you have the Red Room, then the Blue Room, then the Green Room, and then the state dining room. Now, the blue room is almost always used as the reception room inside the White House. It is, in fact, now painted white with a blue rug on the floor. Colored blue was first acquired in the presidency of Martin Van Buren's administration in 1837. As you walk through the red room, the blue room, the green room, off to one's left, if you're walking east to west, out the windows you can see the little garden that Jacqueline Kennedy started, the magnolia tree, which was planted by Andrew Jackson. It's a never-to-be-forgotten feeling if you're in that room, whether you're just a rank-and-file citizen of the United States or an outgoing president or an incoming president, two of whom, one each, are inside that room at this moment. Now, up here on Capitol Hill, the dignitaries are beginning to arrive for the inauguration of itself. Rain hats, very much in fashion today. And again, let's listen as the choir sings a bit. Beautiful moment there. And John Roberts is outside the west front of the Capitol. John, as the choir sings, set the scene for us.
Well, Dan, you speak of history, Dan. I think if you wanted to evoke a little bit of history, you could go back to 1889 and the inauguration of Benjamin Harrison, who was the last person to have lost the popular vote, but won the Electoral College because it was pouring with rain all of that day, and it seems to be doing the same thing today. We had maybe about a half an hour where the drizzle had let up, but the wind has picked up, and the rain is starting to come down now, which is going to make it awfully wet for all of the dignitaries up there on the platform. As you see, a lot of them have donned plastic rain jackets and are prepared to sit out here for the next couple of hours in what now has become fairly cold and miserable temperatures. You can see just about directly behind me some of the governors from the 50 states have assembled, including Governor Keating of Oklahoma, who was widely touted to be a front-running candidate for Attorney General. Tom Ridge from Pennsylvania is also there, along with George Pataki from New York. Both of those, of course, were touted as being vice presidential candidates, and Tom Ridge recently in the running to be Secretary of Defense. Peppered along the bottom part of the platform here are some of the guests of the President-elect and the Vice President-elect and some senior staff members. We have some senators who have started to arrive. I saw Strom Thurmond, who recently celebrated his 98th birthday, seated there, but it looks like he may have moved back inside or is currently being moved back inside to get out of the cold. And then over here on the right-hand side of the platform, we have the 435 members of the House of Representatives. Now, of course, when we talk about the governors, there's a couple of governors who won't be there. Governor Jeb Bush will be seated with George Bush's family, and Governor Christy Todd Whitman from New Jersey is going to be seated among the nominees for the President-elect's cabinet. One of his first official duties following his swearing in will be to officially present the names of his nominees to Congress. And as well, he's expected to issue a couple of executive orders. One of those executive orders will be to block some of the executive orders that President Clinton has been issuing in recent weeks. Now, when we talk about the inaugural address, which will be coming up right after he is sworn in, the President-elect is going to be talking a lot about compassion, courage, and civility, in really what will be probably the most important speech that he has ever given, because it is going to set the tone for the next 4 years. He's reaching back into history a little bit. Mark Gerson, who is the person who wrote out the framework of the speech, reviewed all 53 inaugural addresses, not taking any particular phrase from any one, more just the tone. And if there's any kind of real reference that we could draw here, Dan, it might be to John F. Kennedy when he's asking people to become citizens of this country and to work together for the country. Dan?
John Roberts. The beautiful singing is by the Youth Performing Arts School, YPAS, from Louisville, Kentucky.
Singing Shenandoah, and every time I hear that song, you get chills. It kind of brings back the whole course of American history of the riverboat keelsmen of the Ohio River, where it became popular in the Mississippi River. But to me, it's a quintessential American composition. It's every time you hear it, you just kind of get very moved by it.
And let's listen to it as we, in the background, as we go to the White House. The doors have opened. People always think there's plenty to say, but the pictures say it all here. At this snapshot moment of history, the transfer of power in the most powerful nation on the planet, the combined economic and military superpower, that is the United States of America. The defeated party in the last election, a free election among a free people, quietly, respectfully, gracefully handing the reins of power to the victors. Doesn't happen very many places very often. Hasn't happened very many places very often through the whole long river of history. The Clinton era ends. The Bush era begins. All but 4 presidents attended the swearing-in of their successor: John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Johnson, and Richard Nixon. The only presidents who did not attend the swearing-in of their successors for various reasons over the 200-plus span of American history.
Sometimes, Dan, sitting presidents would not go to the inaugural ceremony with the president. Grant refused as incoming to go with Andrew Johnson. He had been impeached and he felt he had humiliated himself and the country, so Grant refused to go with them to the ceremony, and they just sort of appeared there on stage.
Well, then Richard Nixon, who had resigned as a, quote, unindicted co-conspirator in a widespread criminal conspiracy, did not attend the swearing-in of his successor, Gerald Ford. A happier and better time here today in Washington, D.C., January 2001.
Well, I think it's fair to say, Dan, that some of the former presidents or those who were leaving office enjoyed this ceremony and some of them didn't. Ronald Reagan seemed in great good humor as he left. Of course, his vice president, George Bush, was coming to power. Truman certainly didn't enjoy the company with Eisenhower, and I think they didn't even speak as they rode toward the Capitol.
That's an interesting thing, and Professor Brinkley, in the few minutes, perhaps moments we have, quickly, that Eisenhower-Truman handover, Truman handing over to Eisenhower, in the White House, it was frosty, man, frosty.
Very frosty. Well, they, of course, were not good friends, and it was a very difficult campaign in 1952. Truman didn't run, Adlai Stevenson did. But throughout the campaign, Ike was saying things like, I'll go to end the Korean War, Truman's a lousy president. bad blood was created there. So on inaugural day, when Eisenhower pulled up, he refused to get out of the car like we just saw both Clinton and Bush do. He refused to get out and go meet the president in the White House. Instead, I mean, even to go meet, so Truman and Eisenhower ended up not shaking hands, not meeting.
Nor were there very many happy words when Jimmy Carter left and Ronald Reagan came to Washington.
We had the hostages, of course, the whole hostage crisis looming over the country at that moment.
Let's go to Bill Plant, one of the most experienced White House correspondents in the craft. Bill, there's been some talk that soon-to-be First Lady Laura Bush is giving advice: don't give up your territory, don't give up space, don't give up room space inside the White House, always at a premium. That is very important to you as First Lady to have your own space in the White House, so don't give it up to these mostly men who are moving in and want it for their own purposes. What about that?
Well, Dan, Hillary Rodham Clinton had an office on the second floor of the West Wing, and that is really prized real estate. And there's been some suggestion, I've heard it myself from people, advice to incoming Republicans: tell the First Lady to keep that office space. But as far as we know, Mrs. Bush is going to be content with an office in the East Wing, which is the traditional preserve of the First Lady. She's indicated that her main concern in her time in office is going to be literacy for children. She's going to promote literacy programs. She started doing that yesterday at an event for American authors. And she has shown no interest so far in reclaiming that office space on the second floor of the West Wing. You can be sure, as you know, that there will be any number of other Bush aides who will eagerly grab for that space, because it's what they call the first law of real estate: location, location, location. The closer you are to the Oval Office, the more important that makes you.
Well, Bill, Bob Schieffer makes a good point that, for better or for worse, and some people will argue it one way, some another, there have been two power centers in the Clinton White House, that of Mrs. now Senator Clinton and the president himself.
It's very unlikely that you will see that in this Bush White House, Dan, because Mrs. Bush, as we heard in her interview with Jane Clayson earlier, sees for herself a what you might call more traditional role as First Lady. Hillary Rodham Clinton, after all, came here offering herself as 2 for 1. You get 2 for the price of 1. And that failed after the health care initiative failed, but now, of course, she's a United States Senator. So she always had a rather different career path in mind for herself, I think, than does Laura Bush, the incoming First Lady. Dan, you talked about being a fly on the wall in there earlier. I imagine that it was probably a very civil exchange. All politicians are pretty skilled at making small talk at times like this, and these are two pretty skilled politicians. Dan?
Two very skilled politicians, and earlier Bob Schieffer was making the point that even those who don't like President Clinton and who abhor what he stands for, give him credit for being one of the better politicians ever to sit in the American presidency, and by anybody's estimation, when he chooses to turn it on, a very charming man. The same can be said of George W. Bush, and for those who say to themselves, how did George W. Bush get to be president anyway? Well, there are a lot of answers to that, not all of them Democrats like, but one is that George W. Bush has the ability to charm in a way that I think it's fair to say, without being derogatory, that his father, President Bush, sometimes had difficulty with. President Bush being, somewhat more, in fact, I would say considerably more reserved. He certainly was a graceful man, very intelligent man, and could be charming. But his son, George W., has the charm business down pretty pat.
There's no question about that, Dan. Where his dad was sort of an Eastern blue blood, George Bush grew up out in Midland, Texas, and with all the good things that come with an upbringing in Midland, Texas. He was very self-deprecating. He has a great sense of humor. He doesn't take himself all that seriously, and he's a genuinely nice person.
Well, that brings up one point, Bob, and perhaps we can bring Gloria Borger in to talk about this a little, that Bill Clinton was a very experienced governor. He'd been governor of Arkansas for a long time, and he had the ability, as he came into the presidency, to sort of personally dominate any landscape he occupied. Now, George Bush has been governor in Texas for 6 years, but he doesn't come into the presidency, would you not say, Gloria, with that ability, although he certainly has the potential to develop it.
Well, as Bob was saying, he can be charming on a one-on-one basis. What he has not yet developed is something that Bill Clinton, I think, had innately, which is an ability to charm a national audience, an ability to walk in a room, go up to a podium and extemporaneously speak and have every single person in that audience believe that he is talking to them individually. That is something that George W. Bush clearly does not yet have, and that may be something that he has gotten from his father, but it is something that they are aware of in this incoming White House staff, and they are working with him very closely on that. But he is not a great extemporaneous speaker the way Bill Clinton can be, Dan.
Well, we're going to get very soon, at noon Eastern Time, coming up a little more than an hour from now, a chance to see the newly additionally practiced speaking style of George W. Bush. He's, as Bill Plant told us earlier, and Gloria, you said earlier, he's been practicing for this inauguration address today. George Bush has. George Bush seems to subscribe to an old Texas saying that goes along the lines, well, I don't always learn fast, but I learn good. And that he is of the kind of personality that says, look, I don't pretend to know everything, but I think I can learn almost anything. And while he comes into the presidency as not a very polished and, for that matter, practiced public speaker, for that matter, not even very practiced in that tool, weapon of most politicians these days, the teleprompters. We've seen any number of times, but he's getting better at it, and we'll see how he does today fairly soon. George W. Bush, in just 1 hour, will be the President of the United States. You're watching CBS News coverage of the inauguration live from Washington.
He's going to come out just as
CBS News at the Capitol of the United States in Washington, D.C., the presidential inauguration. This is the hour before the actual swearing in of the 43rd President of the United States. Dan Rather in our booth, high atop the west front of the Capitol, with our chief Washington correspondent Bob Schieffer, Professor Doug Brinkley from down at New Orleans. And what you're looking at here is the scene where the inauguration will actually take place, the swearing in. Down Pennsylvania Avenue, this is the scene at the White House as the Clintons and the Bushes begin to break up this meeting in the White House. We're not sure exactly when they're going to come out, but they're due to come out fairly soon. So at one end of Pennsylvania Avenue, you have the traditional meeting of the outgoing president with the incoming president, their spouses, and the incoming and outgoing vice president with their spouses. And then as the Marine Band plays at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, things are being put in order for the actual swearing in, the peaceful transfer of power at the top in our constitutional republic. The weather is better than had been feared at this hour. Yes, it's raining a little on and off. Yes, it's muddy down there where those who want to eyewitness this in person will be standing. And yes, ponchos and head covers are the order today, those who will be attending this outdoor ceremony. But as inauguration days go, so far, this one hasn't been all that bad. Snow is predicted for tonight. Right now, it's sort of, to use the word the British might prefer, mizzling out there, something between rain and drizzle. And on average presidential inaugural days, the temperature, I think, has been about 37, 38 degrees, which is about what it is today. A little windy and sometimes a little rainy, so not all that bad. Professor Brinkley?
You know, from Thomas Jefferson all the way down to Franklin Roosevelt, the inaugurals were usually held in March. And it was the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, which took place in, the bill came up in 1932. It got ratified in 1933. Roosevelt delivered that famous "We have nothing to fear but fear itself" address in March of 1933. But from that point on, the Constitution mandates that it's held January 20th. Well, hence, that's a bad weather month in Washington, D.C. This may be the northernmost southern city, but it's still awful cold here sometimes in the winter, so you're bound to get some bad weathers on inaugural day. It's become really part of the tradition of the inaugural itself, figuring out what the weather is.
Well, This may be as good a time as any as we await the emergence, the exit from the White House of the Bushes on their way to the inauguration, that the longest inaugural address in history. Let us hope that nothing even near this happens today. William Henry Harrison, 1841, 8,445 words. He rambled on, insisting delivering this long, and let me tell you folks, that was a long address with no overcoat or hat. As you pointed out to me once, Professor Brinkley, he was an old Indian fighter, and he wanted to show that, boy, as I move into the presidency, you got a real man here. He consequently caught pneumonia, though, and died a month later. His speech ran 1 hour and 45 minutes in a really bitter cold. And among the more foolish inaugural addresses, one hesitates to use that word, but in one of the most foolish inaugural addresses had to be that one. Bob Schieffer, I thought maybe you'd raise your hand there.
Well, I was just going to say, we don't think that George Bush is going to speak that long. We think it's going to be about 10 minutes. In fact, I think brevity is going to be the word for George Bush. And here it comes, Dan. They're coming out of the White House.
Tipper Gore with Mrs. Cheney. Lynn Cheney, who intends to carry on her very active career as an educator. Vice President Al Gore with the incoming Vice President-to-be, Richard Dick Cheney of Wyoming.
Gore's been the most influential vice president in American history, but some people think Dick Cheney might even be more influential than he was.
Well, we'll see. But certainly Vice President Gore, throughout the Clinton administration until, let us say, the last year and a half when he was campaigning for president, Gore was a very influential vice president, and as you say, generally acknowledged to be one of, if not the most influential vice presidents in history. Dick Cheney, given his long, deep Washington experience, if he chooses to be so, and if George W. Bush chooses to let him be so, maybe even more influential.
Well, so far he certainly has, naming Cheney to run the transition. An enormous process and really an enormous bureaucracy. And in many ways, Dan, I think Dick Cheney is, if he continues to do as he's doing, is going to wind up the only president, vice president who had a real job. We'll see how long that lasts.
Laura Bush, in her favorite color blue, senator from New York, and outgoing First Lady, escorting Laura Bush to her limousine. Wonder what President Clinton is saying to soon-to-be President George Bush, or vice versa, right at this moment, just as they're to say goodbye here. Love to know.
That's the fun of history. Sometime we'll get people to, either a week or a month or a year to tell what actually occurred in that meeting today. Might even be in tomorrow's paper.
No surprise here, President Clinton talking and George W. Bush listening attentively.
I read recently Bill Clinton doesn't really know George W. Bush. You think that they've been in politics together for so long, but they've really only had a couple of short encounters before today. They had that one meeting and then a couple before that.
And in their almost matching blue ties, they get into the limousine. And yes, there's a protocol. The still president, the outgoing president, sits on the away from the driver's side seat in the back of the limousine. The incoming president, the president-elect, sits right behind the driver. These things are carefully choreographed and orchestrated in advance, as they have to be.
It's interesting, though, to watch, Dan. I was just thinking as I was watching them get in the car, some presidents have enjoyed being president. Ronald Reagan loved being president. Some have found the White House a prison and seemed to be miserable. Jimmy Carter did not seem to enjoy any of his presidency. Bill Clinton, for all the troubles that he had, and let's remember, his administration and he was under investigation of one kind or another for 7 of the 8 years he was president. Still, he seemed to love the presidency and enjoy it. He told people in these last couple of weeks, he said, you know, there may be others who were better presidents, but nobody had more fun at the job than I did.
Well, you may think he was a good or bad president, but no one can doubt that he loved being president. When I interviewed him, Bob, as one of his exit interviews just before Christmas, there was a poignancy. You could feel it in the room, and you could feel it in the aura around him. I'm not making too much of this. That he really didn't want to leave. Now,
he's not leaving. I mean, he's just moving up the street.
He didn't want to leave this house.
I know what you're
And
saying.
at one point, I really thought they might have to call the sheriff to come in and say, you know, we're going to get your furniture and your stuff. You got to go now. He really loved the job. So we may have better presidents than Bill Clinton, but it's doubtful we'll have one who loved being president more than this president. I agree with you. Ronald Reagan also really enjoyed it.
And here's something else to remember. Bill Clinton is 54 years old. He's leaving the presidency at the same age that Ronald Reagan was when he ran for governor of California.
Stunning. By the way, you notice on the limousine, the presidential limousine, that they've already changed the license plates on that car. For those of you who say, well, what are they talking about up there? Well, Bill Clinton had put on, as one of his last acts, had put on the presidential limousine for some weeks now, the statehood for D.C. license plate, which is very popular here in the District of Columbia. George Bush and company failed to be amused by that, I think might be the best way to put it. And they've seen to it immediately that the license plates change. So when the new president comes back from the swearing in, riding in the presidential limousine, he will not have the statehood for D.C. license plates on his car. They've already made the change. Well, let's listen to the Marine Band as the motorcade makes its way from the White House down Pennsylvania Avenue to the other end and to the west front of the Capitol. And can you imagine, one can only imagine the emotion of George W. Bush in that car. His dream fulfilled. Succeeding not directly, but succeeding his father.
Ladies and gentlemen,
in the presidency.
William Rehnquist and the Associate Justice.
And I guess we could also add
Supreme.
riding with the man who beat his father in his father's bid for re-election.
Yes, we'd like for you to hear the Marine Band, but they've taken a break for a moment. Now they pick it up again. Let's hear it. Listening to the band play on and the motorcade roll on is Phil Jones, who's along the motorcade route. Phil?
Well, Dan, the band that's playing here is familiar to the president-elect. It is the Crawford, Texas High School Band. They've got a prime location, high rent area right here at 13th and Pennsylvania. As the president, the outgoing president, and the president-elect start coming up, they're nearing right now 14th and Pennsylvania, right in front of Pershing Park. Now, this is where demonstrators got a permit to be. The biggest group there, it's called Day of Outrage, and it includes mostly the new Black Panther Party. They are protesting the contested election and racism throughout the country. It is a large group, one of the largest groups here. Matter of fact, we've been watching as these protesters come in, and I would judge maybe we've got 500 or 600. The largest group right now, close to where the president and president-elect are about to come. Along the parade route, in the past hour or so, police officers have lined up. I would say they're probably 6 to 10 feet apart. They are there for security purposes. And in the middle of the lineup here also are other people in uniform, and these are military personnel here for ceremonial purposes. We're told there are about 2,000 military people. So right now, the president and the president-elect are at 14th and Pennsylvania. This is where Mr. Bush is seeing his first protesters on his inauguration day. They have been checked at all of the security points coming in here to make sure that they don't have anything that they can throw or to do any damage as the the motorcade goes by. Coming up now, and right now you will see, and the president-elect is seeing signs along the way. These protesters, the whole range of things, from the contested election to racism to abortion and to the death penalty. Right now, the president-elect is right in front of the Crawford, Texas High School band as they're playing, and he will move on up. But what's surprising on this day is you look at this thing and you say, my goodness, they had an inauguration and nobody came. At least on this first part of this big day for George W. Bush. Right now you don't see many people here, but of course they have time to get here after the swearing-in ceremony and to be here when he comes back after being sworn in as the 43rd president. But there they go, and they are on their way, soon to arrive on Capitol Hill. Dan?
Phil Jones along the parade route. This is a shot of the motorcade as it comes toward the Capitol, taken from high atop the Capitol.
Former Majority Leader of the Senate, Howard Baker.
It may surprise you to know, and we triple-checked this before we came on the air, that the first inauguration, which was fully motorized with motor cars, was that of President Harding in 1821, while motor cars were used in inaugurations beginning, I think, check me here, Professor Brinkley, in about
1921.
1921 is the first fully motorized inaugural parade, but automobiles, of course, came into use just after the turn of the century, but horse-drawn carriages were considered traditional, and so it wasn't until 1921 and the immediate post-World War I era that began using motor cars. And by the way, people always talk of the presidential limousine being bulletproof and bomb-proof. Of course, no vehicle can be completely. It is highly bullet resistant, and the bottom of the car constructed to resist bombs. Terrible subject to speak of, but in this day and age, speak of it we must. With the threat of terrorism, a real problem, to say the least, worldwide. And when considering defense policy, for example, the new president, as was the case with the last president, has to take into account the worldwide spread of terrorism, not just in terms of defending the inauguration day, but defending the United States of America.
Well, you know, these cars, these limousines, while they look like cars, they really are tanks. I mean, they're made of iron. They're tanks on rubber wheels. I remember being in a motorcade with Gerald Ford one time in Connecticut when a kid, by mistake, ran a red light and ran broadside into the president's limousine. Well, you can imagine this poor man, the car looked like an accordion. No one was injured, obviously. But all of a sudden, here's this kid in the middle of the night. He runs into a car and he's surrounded by people with machine guns. It was quite a moment. But what cars?
Jeb Stuart, the younger brother of the president-elect, arrives enthusiastically, walking joyfully and happily up to the stand where he'll view the swearing in, and why wouldn't he be? Jeb Bush taking his seat. We had said on election night when it looked like Florida was going to go for Gore that President-elect Bush might be as mad as a rained-on rooster about Jeb Bush. It all turned out to be moot, since in the end Jeb Bush and other Republicans delivered Florida and the winning margin to Brother George W. Bush, delivered it at the polls and in the legal battle that followed. Professor Brinkley.
Yeah, last evening, former President Bush gave a talk with James Baker with Baker's law firm, and what he said, former President Bush said how angry he was about the way Jeb was treated, and that if there one thing that bothered him in this election, that he thought his son was the most honest person in the media, and sometimes were making it seem like he was behind what was going on in Florida, and he wasn't. It was a very emotional talk former President Bush gave last night about his son, Jeb.
The motorcade is turned on to Constitution Avenue now as it nears the thickening crowds on the edges, the far edges, if you will, of the inauguration celebration area that is stretching out from the west front of the Capitol.
look at this procession, it's hard to imagine that the first inaugural Washington was Thomas Jefferson in 1800, and he just left his Florida Avenue boarding house and walked, pulled out a speech out of his pocket, delivered it, and then walked back to the boarding house.
So as the motorcade arrives now, just in what we'll call the outer area of the west front of the Capitol, the crowds have increased in size and in their cheering of the president. We paid some attention to the protesters and demonstrators against the incoming Bush presidency. But let it be said for perspective and context that the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of people here today, both Republican and Democrat, are here as a celebration as much as anything. Some of the Democrats might argue that. I can hear someone in the living room in my mind's ear saying, well, wait a minute, we're not celebrating this. Not true. And the Chief Justice, Rehnquist, has taken his seat with a colorful hat. He is the one who instituted those stripes on the sleeve for the Chief Justice, which have been controversial, but as is usually the case, the Supreme Court quietly controversial, whether the Chief Justice should try to single himself out that way. But nonetheless, he has done so. You remember during the impeachment proceedings against President Clinton, over which he presided in the Senate, he wore that stripes on the sleeve Chief Justice robe, and he wears it again today, and he was wearing it the day the Supreme Court, in effect, delivered the presidency to George W. Bush, that is, made the decision that, in effect, it would be Bush, something the historians, future historians, present and future historians, no doubt, will be writing about for a long time to come. Dick Cheney, the vice president-elect, chose Chief Justice Rehnquist to administer his oath. This will mark only the third time that the Chief Justice will be giving both of the oaths.
Dan, as you see the limousines, they're now pulling into the east front of the Capitol, and those steps you can see behind, that's where the inaugurations used to be held. On that side of the Capitol, on the east front. Ronald Reagan, of course, changed that. Mike Deaver, his vicar of visuals, as they called him, looked out at that great view on the west side of the Capitol one day and said, we need to put this on television. And he was absolutely right, and ever since, that's where we've had the inaugurals. But it used to be on this side of the Capitol where the inaugural party, president, former president, and all of them will go into the Capitol.
36 of the 54 inaugurations actually been held at this east front, so we don't confuse people. The inauguration itself is going to be held on the opposite side of the Capitol where you're viewing here. This is the way most dignitaries are driven up to the Capitol. This is on the east front of the Capitol. This faces the Supreme Court, if you will. And what's going to happen here, that the official party, they get out of their limousines here, they go in the law library entrance to the Capitol here on the east side, and then they'll go into holding rooms inside the Capitol itself.
Hey buddy, how are you? Enjoyed being with you the other day. How are you? Thank you.
President Clinton with a broad smile at the outgoing president. President-elect Bush with the tight smile of the incoming president. Now this shot is from inside the Capitol itself as they make their way from the law library entrance on the east front entrance of the Capitol into their holding rooms. And the hour draws near for George Bush to be sworn in. Bob Schieffer, for those who have never seen the inside of the Capitol, one can only say we hope before you pass on, you and the children will, because there's such a sense of history in every nook and cranny, every corridor and step.
Well, I guess because I've covered the Congress so long, I'm prejudiced, but to me, it's the Capitol that is my favorite building in Washington, my favorite monument.
Our CBS News coverage of the inauguration of George W. Bush as President of the United States. He'll become president in less than an hour. We'll be right back. Back in front of the west front of the Capitol, inside the Capitol itself, President Clinton, President-elect Bush. We'll soon be seeing them come out to the inaugural stand itself. Here, the father and mother of the president-elect, former President George Bush, Barbara Bush. How proud they must be, and how proud they are justified in being. Not only having a son to follow the father into the presidency, but having another son elected as governor of one of the country's more populous states. President Clinton and President-elect Bush are still in holding rooms. Keep in mind that Mr. Bush must be sworn in at noon Eastern Time, 35 minutes from now. Theodore Roosevelt, president from 1901 to 1909, wore a ring to his 1905 inauguration that held a lock of Abraham Lincoln's hair cut off after Lincoln was shot, wore it in a ring. George W. Bush here in 2001 will be wearing a pair of presidential cufflinks given to him by his father when he, George W., became governor of Texas. We're told he has never worn them before. He chooses to wear them this day.
That ring Theodore Roosevelt wore was given to him by John Hay, who was used to be a personal assistant to Abe Lincoln, was alive all those years up into the 20th century, and then ended up giving him the ring.
As we look at George Bush the Elder and Barbara Bush, Bob Schieffer briefly stated the main accomplishments of the first Bush presidential administration were successful Gulf War prosecution, in many ways carried on the presidency of Ronald Reagan, in many ways sort of the third Reagan term.
I think that's the way history will look at that, as the third, kind of the end of the Reagan term, the third Reagan term. But I think what George Bush will be remembered for is the Gulf War, which was, any way you cut it, a major accomplishment. Some would criticize him for saying they didn't go far enough and get rid of Saddam Hussein. But had that been allowed to stand, we would be living in a much different world today, because the United States would be totally dependent on outside sources for its fuel, for its oil. So I think you have to give him high credit for that, and I think in the end that's what he'll be remembered most for.
Well, of course, and understandably, the Bush people are like, let's pick this up.
Ladies and gentlemen, former President and Mrs. George Bush and Mrs. Jenna Welch, accompanied by the daughters of the President-elect, Jenna and Barbara Bush.
As we like to mention from time to time, you are looking at history, not just because a new president is being sworn in, but because for one of the few times, in fact, the only second time in our history, the son of a president is being sworn in as president while his father is living. And in this case, unlike the case with the Adams family in the early 1800s, the father is attending the swearing in of his son as president. And we like for you to hear the sounds, be able to hear the sounds, as well as see the sights of this inauguration, which is why we try to pause from time to time and let you pick up the trumpets playing, sound of the bugles, and the wonderful Marine Band. The matriarch of the Bush family saying her hellos. As we said earlier, that there are those who say, well, the George Bush presidency, 1989 to 1993, was in a way the third Reagan term. Chelsea Clinton walking in. And in some ways, that's unfair. That George Bush the elder did put his stamp on the presidency in the one term he was there. Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton walking through. Laura and George W. Bush have 19-year-old fraternal twin daughters, Barbara and Jenna. So when you see them, you will know, yes, they are twins. And speaking of people who walk through this day with great pride, what pride Hillary Clinton must feel within herself, having been elected to public office from the Empire State, New York, on her own, walking with Tipper Gore. Chelsea Clinton, who soon to embark on her post-university career, having been a student at Stanford University. The Bushes had requested on several occasions that they hope the press will allow their daughters, Rosalind Carter, Rosalind reading Chelsea Clinton there, nice picture. The Bushes had saying they hope that their daughters will be afforded privacy by the press as they go through school. Jenna at the University of Texas in Austin and Barbara at Yale. And Chelsea Clinton was pretty much accorded that as she went through Stanford. The crowd grows quiet. We'll do the same here for a moment.
Ladies and gentlemen, the First Lady, Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton, and the wife of the Vice President, Mrs. Tipper Gore, accompanied by Martin Paoli, Senate Democratic Secretary, Jackie Clegg Dodd, Mrs. Gephardt, and Mrs. Dasher.
Bob Cheever, there was that talk during the latter stages of the Clinton presidency that Mrs. Clinton and Mrs. Gore had grown at least a bit apart.
Well, I suppose there had to be some sticky situations there because, you know, Al Gore could never decide whether he wanted Bill Clinton to be a part of his campaign or not be a part of his campaign. He couldn't decide if he wanted him to appear with him or not appear with him. And people think, well, these are all these political decisions that politicians make. You always have to remember, politicians are human beings. They have families, they have wives, and they very easily cite what they see as slights or snubs of somewhere or the other. So I don't think there's anything out of the ordinary about that. I think it would be kind of strange if there weren't some kind of sticky situations in situations like that.
And now the soon-to-be First Lady takes the long, happy walk through that thin corridor as we hear her heels against the tile.
There's some sticky situations between the vice president and the president, Dan, not just between the wives.
And now there'll be the announcement of the First Lady to be.
Accompanied by Elizabeth Letchworth, Senate Republican Secretary, Elaine Chao, Mrs. Lott, Mrs. Hastert, and Mrs. Harper.
Bush, a school teacher from much of her adult life. Midland, Houston, Austin.
Librarian.
A librarian. We had talked earlier about George W. Bush, at least not yet, being an accomplished political public speaker. Mrs. Bush, when she chooses to do so, is a very effective speaker. I heard her speak at the Convention of Texas Librarians just a few years ago. She gave a very good talk. Short, had humor on both ends and some in the middle, very substantive. She'll be a different kind of First Lady.
It's very interesting. She's gotten to be a very good public speaker. One of the things that when George Bush decided to run for president, he said that she told him, yes, I'll go along with you if I don't have to make a speech. She had talked at teachers' conventions and places like that, but she'd never really made a political speech, and she really made the first political speeches of her life. During this presidential campaign, she didn't do very much of that, beyond just courtesy remarks and things like that during his governor's races. But she's gotten very good at it. She's a very articulate woman, in some ways more articulate than her husband, and she has a great interest in books, a great interest in reading, and I think you'll see her devote most of her efforts in those areas, Dan.
We're going to bring in John Roberts, who's standing not very many yards away from where the new president will be sworn in. John, I don't know whether you can see the picture from inside the building. We have outgoing President Bill Clinton walking beside the outgoing Vice President Al Gore, walking toward what there is in the sunlight today to pass the power. John?
Well, Dan, I can't see that particular picture from inside the Capitol building, but certainly right here just outside the platform on the west side of the Capitol, people are waiting with anticipation for the moment when they all walk out. You know, you talk about Al Gore, and this really has to be a bittersweet moment for him. He still firmly believes, even though he hasn't said it publicly in the last couple of weeks, that he won this election, that it should be him that's standing out there, and if it weren't for 930 votes, he probably would be, or if it weren't for a number of mistakes that were made, he probably would be. But he's been gracious about this. We do know that during this speech, the president-elect will pay tribute to the vice president and acknowledge the battle that they fought against each other.
As we hear ruffles and flourishes, and then hail to the chief to be followed.
The President of the United States, the Honorable William Jefferson Clinton, and the Vice President of the United States, the Honorable Albert Gore Jr., accompanied by Senator Christopher Dodd, Representative Richard Gephardt, Senator Tom Daschle, Gary Sisko, Secretary of the Senate, Jeffrey Trandoff, Clerk of the House of
Well, we may not
Representatives,
hear hail to the chief
and Jay Egan,
frequently after ruffles
Chief
and flourishes
Administrative
appear,
Officer
but
of the House
not
of
on this particular
Representatives.
occasion because they wanted to announce others. Now, slightly delayed. John Roberts, you were saying it's a bittersweet moment for Al Gore, who we caught there in a nice, almost ear-to-ear smile. Bittersweet, yes, but in that place behind his heart where he really thinks, as we see him shake hands with former President Bush, it has to be more bitter than sweet for Al Gore because, as you say, rightly or wrongly, justifiably or otherwise, he remains convinced that he got more votes and more electoral votes than George Bush.
Well, he does, Dan, and you know, he saw it as being almost his lifelong destiny to be president of these United States. He remembers back to his father's bitter defeat running for the Senate in Tennessee back in 1970, a bitter and divisive election campaign, almost mirroring exactly what happened in the fall of this year, and then Al Gore going down to bitter defeat after trying so hard in the post-election phase to try to capture back what he thought was his.
Well, who is to say that he won't get another chance? This is neither the time nor the place to talk about it, but fair to say that Al Gore, having come so close, so breathtakingly, heart-poundingly close, may very well feel that he wants to make another run at it next time around.
Well, I think, Dan, he was no more gracious at any point in the campaign than the night when he conceded the election.
Well, he's been very gracious since then. If, as many people argue, the mark of a man or a woman is how well they handle adversity, then one can say that Al Gore has told us much about his character in these weeks, now more than a month, since he was declared
the Vice President-elect of the United States, the Honorable Richard Bruce Cheney, accompanied by Senator Trent Lott, Representative Richard Army, Loretta Sims, Senate Deputy Sergeant-at-Arms, Carrie Hanley, House Deputy Sergeant-at-Arms, and Lanny Gerst, Executive Director, Joint Congressional Committee for Inaugural Ceremonies.
Now, as you look at the Cheneys, this is, by any measure, a great American love story. Dick Cheney, the high school football captain, Lynn Cheney, the nationally accomplished drum majorette, and now they stand side by side, he about to be sworn in as vice president. And the next president of the United States of America, George W. Bush, enters the corridor for the walk which will take him to power and responsibility. Let's listen and watch as you see and hear what he is seeing and hearing.
Oh, yeah. I don't want to see that.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President-elect of the United States, George Walker Bush, accompanied by Senator Mitch McConnell, Senator Christopher Dodd, Speaker J. Dennis Hastert, Senator Trent Lott, Representative Richard Army, Representative Richard Gephardt, Jim Ziegler, Senate Sergeant-at-Arms, Bill Livengood, House Sergeant-at-Arms, and Tamara Somerville, Chief of Staff, Joint Congressional Committee for Inaugural Ceremonies. Ladies and gentlemen, the chairman of the Joint Congressional Committee for Inaugural Ceremonies, the Honorable Mitch McConnell.
Everyone, please be seated so we can begin.
Senator Mitch McConnell is chairman of this year's inaugural committee.
Welcome to the 54th inauguration of the President and Vice President of the United States of America. Today we honor the past in commemorating 2 centuries of inaugurations in Washington, D.C. As well, we embrace the future, this day marking the first inauguration of the 21st century and the new millennium. America has now spanned 4 centuries, her promise still shining bright, the beginning and present linked by timeless ideals and faith. The enduring strength of our Constitution, which brings us to the west front of the Capitol today, attests to the wisdom of America's founders and the heroism of generations of Americans who fought wars and toiled in peace to preserve this legacy of liberty. In becoming the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush will assume the sacred trust as guardian of our Constitution. Dick Cheney will be sworn in as our new Vice President. Witnessed by the Congress, Supreme Court, governors, and presidents past, the current president will stand by as the new president peacefully takes office. This is a triumph of our democratic republic, a ceremony befitting a great nation. In his father's stead, the Reverend Franklin Graham is with us today to lead the nation in prayer. Please stand for the invocation. Reverend Graham.
Let us pray. Blessed are you, O Lord our God. Yours, O God, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the majesty and the splendor. For everything in heaven and earth is yours. Yours, O Lord, is the kingdom. You are exalted as head over all. Wealth and honor come from you. You are the ruler of all things. In your hands are strength and power to exalt and to give strength to all. As President Lincoln once said, we have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We have grown in numbers, wealth, and power, as no other nation has ever grown, but we have forgotten God. It behooves us then to humble ourselves before the offended powers, to confess our national sins, and to pray for clemency and forgiveness. O Lord, as we come together on this historic and solemn occasion to inaugurate once again a president and vice president, teach us afresh that power, wisdom, and salvation come only from your hand. We pray, O Lord, for President-elect George W. Bush and Vice President-elect Richard D. Cheney, to whom you have entrusted leadership of this nation at this moment in history. We pray that you'll help them bring our country together so that we may rise above partisan politics and seek the larger vision of your will for our nation. Use them to bring reconciliation between the races, healing to political wounds, that we may truly become one nation under God. Give our new president and all who advise him calmness in the face of storms, encouragement in the face of frustration, and humility in the face of success. Give them the wisdom to know and to do what is right, and the courage to say no to all that is contrary to your statutes and holy law. Lord, we pray for their families, and especially their wives, Laura Bush and Lynn Cheney, that they may sense your presence and know your love. Today we entrust to you President and Senator Clinton and Vice President Mrs. Gore. Lead them as they journey through new doors of opportunity to serve others. Now, O Lord, we dedicate this presidential inaugural ceremony to you. May this be the beginning of a new dawn for America as we humble ourselves before you and acknowledge you alone as our Lord, our Savior, and our Redeemer. We pray this in the name of the Father, and of the Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Reverend Graham. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce the DuPont Manual Choir of Louisville, Kentucky. Senator Christopher J. Dodd of Connecticut to introduce the Chief Justice of the United States.
Thank you, Senator McConnell. President and Senator Clinton, Vice President and Mrs. Gore, President-elect and Mrs. Bush, and fellow citizens. The Vice President-elect will now take the oath of office. His wife, Lynn, and their daughters, Elizabeth Cheney Perry and Mary Cheney, will hold the family Bible. I have the honor and privilege to now present the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, the Honorable William Hobbs Rehnquist, to administer the oath of office to the Vice President-elect Richard Bruce Cheney.
Mr. Cheney, are you ready to take the oath?
I am.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Richard Bruce Cheney, do solemnly swear.
I, Richard Bruce Cheney, do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
That I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same.
That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same.
That I take this obligation freely.
That I take this obligation freely.
Without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion.
Without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion.
And that I will well and faithfully discharge.
And that I will well and faithfully discharge.
The duties of the office on which I am about to enter.
The duties of the office on which I am about to enter.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
Ladies and gentlemen, Staff Sergeant Alec T. Molley of the United States Army Band will now perform an American medley.
The
It is now my high honor to again present the Chief Justice of the United States, who will administer the presidential oath of office. Everyone, please stand.
Governor, are you ready to take the oath?
I am, sir.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, George W. Bush.
Thank you all. Chief Justice Rehnquist, President Carter, President Bush, President Clinton, distinguished guests, and my fellow citizens. The peaceful transfer of authority is rare in history, yet common in our country. With a simple oath, we affirm old traditions and make new beginnings. As I begin, I thank President Clinton for his service to our nation. And I thank Vice President Gore for a contest conducted with spirit and ended with grace. I am honored and humbled to stand here where so many of America's leaders have come before me, and so many will follow. We have a place, all of us, in a long story, a story we continue, but whose end we will not see. It is a story of a new world that became a friend and liberator of the old. The story of a slave-holding society that became a servant of freedom. The story of a power that went into the world to protect but not possess, to defend but not to conquer. It is the American story, a story of flawed and fallible people, united across the generations by grand and enduring ideals. The grandest of these ideals is an unfolding American promise that everyone belongs, that everyone deserves a chance, that no insignificant person was ever born. Americans are called to enact this promise in our lives and in our laws. And though our nation has sometimes halted and sometimes delayed, we must follow no other course. Through much of the last century, America's faith in freedom and democracy was a rock in a raging sea. Now it is a seed upon the wind, taking root in many nations. Our democratic faith is more than the creed of our country. It is the inborn hope of our humanity, an ideal we carry but do not own, a trust we bear and pass along. And even after nearly 225 years, we have a long way yet to travel. While many of our citizens prosper, others doubt the promise, even the justice of our own country. The ambitions of some Americans are limited by failing schools and hidden prejudice and the circumstances of their birth. And sometimes our differences run so deep, it seems we share a continent, but not a country. We do not accept this, and we will not allow it. Our unity, our union, is the serious work of leaders and citizens in every generation. And this is my solemn pledge. I will work to build a single nation of justice and opportunity. I know this was in our reach because we are guided by a power larger than ourselves, who creates us equal in His image. And we are confident in principles that unite and lead us onward. America has never been united by blood or birth or soil. We are bound by ideals that move us beyond our backgrounds, lift us above our interests, and teach us what it means to be citizens. Every child must be taught these principles. Every citizen must uphold them. And every immigrant, by embracing these ideals, makes our country more, not less, American. Today, we affirm a new commitment to live out our nation's promise through civility, courage, compassion, and character. America at its best matches a commitment to principle with a concern for civility. A civil society demands from each of us goodwill and respect, fair dealing, and forgiveness. Some seem to believe that our politics can afford to be petty because in a time of peace the stakes of our debates appear small. But the stakes for America are never small. If our country does not lead the cause of freedom, it will not be led. If we do not turn the hearts of children toward knowledge and character, we will lose their gifts and undermine their idealism. If we permit our economy to drift and decline, the vulnerable will suffer most. We must live up to the calling we share. Civility is not a tactic or a sentiment. It is the determined choice of trust over cynicism, of community over chaos. And this commitment, if we keep it, is a way to shared accomplishment. America at its best is also courageous. Our national courage has been clear in times of depression and war, when defeating common dangers defined our common good. Now we must choose if the example of our fathers and mothers will inspire us or condemn us. We must show courage in a time of blessing by confronting problems instead of passing them on to future generations. Together we will reclaim America's schools before ignorance and apathy claim more young lives. We will reform Social Security and Medicare sparing our children from struggles we have the power to prevent. And we'll reduce taxes to recover the momentum of our economy and reward the effort and enterprise of working Americans. We will build our defenses beyond challenge, lest weakness invite challenge. We will confront weapons of mass destruction so that a new century is spared new horrors. The enemies of liberty in our country should make no mistake. America remains engaged in the world by history and by choice, shaping a balance of power that favors freedom. We will defend our allies and our interests. We will show purpose without arrogance. We will meet aggression and bad faith with resolve and strength. And to all nations, we will speak for the values that gave our nation birth. America at its best is compassionate. In the quiet of American conscience, we know that deep, persistent poverty is unworthy of our nation's promise. And whatever our views of its cause, we can agree that children at risk are not at fault. Abandonment and abuse are not acts of God. They are failures of love. And the proliferation of prisons, however necessary, is no substitute for hope and order in our souls. Where there is suffering, there is duty. Americans in need are not strangers. They are citizens, not problems, but priorities. And all of us are diminished when any are hopeless. Government has great responsibilities for public safety and public health, for civil rights and common schools. Yet compassion is the work of a nation, not just a government. And some needs and hurts are so deep, they will only respond to a mentor's touch or a pastor's prayer. Church and charity, synagogue and mosque lend our communities their humanity, and they will have an honored place in our plans and in our laws. Many in our country do not know the pain of poverty, but we can listen to those who do. And I can pledge our nation to a goal. When we see that wounded traveler on the road to Jericho, we will not pass to the other side. America at its best is a place where personal responsibility is valued and expected. Encouraging responsibility is not a search for scapegoats. It is a call to conscience. And though it requires sacrifice, it brings a deeper fulfillment. We find the fullness of life not only in options, but in commitments. And we find that children and community are the commitments that set us free. Our public interest depends on private character, on civic duty and family bonds and basic fairness, on uncounted, unhonored acts of decency, which give direction to our freedom. Sometimes in life we're called to do great things, but as a saint of our times has said, every day we are called to do small things with great love. The most important tasks of a democracy are done by everyone. I will live and lead by these principles, to advance my convictions with civility, to pursue the public interest with courage, to speak for greater justice and compassion, to call for responsibility and try to live it as well. In all these ways, I will bring the values of our history to the care of our times. What you do is as important as anything government does. I ask you to seek a common good beyond your comfort, to defend needed reforms against easy attacks, to serve your nation beginning with your neighbor. I ask you to be citizens, citizens not spectators, citizens not subjects, responsible citizens building communities of service and a nation of character. Americans are generous and strong and decent not because we believe in ourselves, but because we hold beliefs beyond ourselves. When this spirit of citizenship is missing, no government program can replace it. When this spirit is present, no wrong can stand against it. After the Declaration of Independence was signed, Virginia statesman John Page wrote to Thomas Jefferson, "We know the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. Do you not think an angel rides in the whirlwind and directs this storm?" Much time has passed since Jefferson arrived for his inauguration. The years and changes accumulate. But the themes of this day, he would know. Our nation's grand story of courage and its simple dream of dignity. We are not this story's author, who fills time and eternity with his purpose. Yet his purpose is achieved in our duty, and our duty is fulfilled in service to one another. Never tiring, never yielding, never finishing, we renew that purpose today to make our country more just and generous, to affirm the dignity of our lives and every life. This work continues. The story goes on, and an angel still rides in the whirlwind and directs this storm. God bless you all, and God bless America.
Please stand now as Pastor Kirby John H. Caldwell will now deliver the benediction. And afterward, please remain standing for the singing of our national anthem, after which the ceremony will be concluded. I call upon Senator Dodd to organize the presidential party after the ceremony has ended to depart the platform. Pastor Caldwell.
Thank you, Senator McConnell. Let us pray, please. Almighty God, the supply and supplier of peace, prudent policy, and nonpartisanship, we bless your holy and righteous name. Thank you, O God, for blessing us with forgiveness, with faith, and with favor. Forgive us for choosing pride over purpose. Forgive us for choosing popularity over principles. And forgive us for choosing materialism over morals. Deliver us from these and all other evils and cast our sins into your sea of forgetfulness to be remembered no more. And Lord, not only do we thank you for our forgiveness, we thank you for faith. Faith to believe that every child can learn and no child will be left behind and no youth will be left out. Thank you for blessing us with the faith to believe that all of your leaders can sit down and reason with one another so that each American is blessed. Thank you for blessing us with the faith to believe that the walls of inequity can be torn down and the gaps between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, the uneducated and the educated can and will be closed. And Lord, lastly, we thank you for favor. We thank you for your divine favor. Let your favor be upon President Clinton and the outgoing administration. May they go forth in spiritual grace and civic greatness. And of course, O Lord, let your divine favor be upon President George W. Bush and First Lady Laura Welch Bush and their family. We decree and declare that no weapon formed against them shall prosper. Let your divine favor be upon the Bush team and all Americans. With the rising of the sun and the going down of the same, may we grow in our willingness and ability to bless you and bless one another. We respectfully submit this humble prayer in the name that's above all other names, Jesus the Christ. Let all who agree say amen.
The United States of America has a new president. The United States of America has a new leader of both the country and the government. A new leader of the executive branch of government. Never to forget that there are two other branches, co-equal, legislative and judicial. This man, George Walker Bush, now leads the executive branch. Salute, Commander-in-Chief, to the soon-to-be Secretary of State, Colin Powell. Our CBS News coverage of the inauguration of the 43rd President of the United States will continue, including some assessments of the new President's inaugural address after these messages.
CBS News presidential inauguration coverage will continue.
Back live in the Capitol. And, quote, the 43rd President of the United States, the new President, the peaceful transfer of authority is rare in history, yet common in our country. With the simple oath, we affirm old traditions and make new beginnings. It's over and George Bush is President. He has delivered an inaugural address of about 14 minutes. Not the shortest ever delivered, but among the shorter inaugural addresses. An inaugural address that struck at least one report of this one as well-crafted, competently delivered, had moments where it soared and none that I recall where it dragged. Bob Schieffer.
I thought it was really a fine speech. I thought it was just right. I thought it said just right, just the right tone. The message of this speech, Dan, it seemed to me, was let's stop the partisan fighting. He put some straw men in there that he was able to knock down. Some think it's okay to have petty politics. Well, of course, no one really thinks that. But I think he did a very good job of saying, I want to reach out. We have to do this in a civil way. Doug Brinkley and I were just talking about kind of the 4 C's of this speech: civility, commitment, compassion, courage. Over and over, he used those words. I thought it was just a very good speech.
Professor?
I agree, and I think you can add church and citizens and character. It seemed to be C was the letter of the speech. Very well written speech, and as you said, Dan, I think very competently delivered. The key moment that I think the press might pick on is at the beginning of the speech when he turned to his rival Al Gore and thanked him for holding a spirited contest in the election and then exiting with such grace. And I think that'll be one of the bites we hear on the news tonight.
I think another thing to add, in this world of modern politics, a modern politician, if he cannot speak extemporaneously, and few do anymore, has to be able to read off a teleprompter in a convincing way. Now, Dan, you and I know that being able to read the teleprompter does not necessarily equate with intelligence or competence in any way, and you and I know several people we could use as examples for that, being in the business of reading teleprompters. But George Bush has gotten better at reading teleprompters. There's no question about it. He was very awkward at it through the campaign and even right up until the election. But I think he's been practicing, and I think the practice paid off.
Professor, if you will agree that perhaps the 2 most quoted inaugural addresses of the 20th century have been Franklin Roosevelt's in 1933, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," and John Kennedy's in 1961, "Ask not what the country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." What is likely to be the most memorable line out of this particular speech?
Well, I think it's what Bob mentioned, that notion of the 4 C's, and maybe even become known as the 4C speech, or what you would expect from a compassionate conservative. I don't think there's one line that jumps out at you. There were some that were really quite nice. I mean, talking about, for example, one line early on about compassion. He says, compassion is the work of a nation, not just a government. I ask you to be citizens, citizens, not spectators, citizens, not subjects, responsible citizens, building communities of service and a nation of character. And going on with that whole nation of this, he wants everybody to be part of this sort of a citizen speech. Again, another one of the C words that keep jumping in there. It gave it a rhythm to the whole speech.
He was saying, Dan, he was asking Americans to be better than they are. And I think Americans like that. They like to be challenged.
We're going to commercial.
Great presidents face great risks. Washington led an army against all odds, creating an independent nation. Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring equality for all. Kennedy faced down Khrushchev over Cuba with the message, "We cherish our freedom and will not be threatened." At Marsh, we believe what they believed. When you manage risk, the opportunities are limitless. Marsh, the world's leader in risk solutions.
Watch the ripples change the size, but never leave the stream.
In today's net economy, companies are struggling to change, struggling with the complexities of e-business, with making intranets, extranets, and the internet work together across any platform around the world. Well, now it can all work together as one net. With Net Services software from Novell, the power to change.
Every 24 hours, you get a whole new chance to take on the world. Get yourself ready with Carnation Instant Breakfast. So delicious, with 21 vitamins and minerals and the energy you need. Carnation Instant Breakfast from Nestle.
This is Unisom Sleep Gels. It helps you sleep. This is Tylenol PM. It helps you sleep too. They both have the exact same amount of the exact same sleep ingredient. But Tylenol PM has added medicine for headaches, backaches, even fever. Do you have a headache? Backache? Fever? Then why take medicine for it? Take Unisom. It's a safe, non-habit-forming way to fall fast asleep.
If you have high blood pressure, you know all these cold medicines warn you not to take them. So take their advice. Don't take them. Take decongestant-free Coricidin HBP. Powerful relief that won't raise your blood pressure.
CBS Tonight.
What's going on here?
The DeLucas have survived sibling rivalry.
You got her pregnant?
Family squabbles.
Don't talk like that in front of your mother.
But they're about to face...
Oh, Frank!
You've had a heart attack. Their toughest challenge ever.
You will do anything to get out of doing the dishes, won't you?
An all-new That's Life. CBS Tonight.
The inauguration itself, the giving of the oath, is over. On the steps of the Capitol, taking the long walk down, former Vice President now, Al Gore and Tipper Gore, as the official party now begins to leave the Capitol. We go to John Roberts, who's standing by outside in the still bizzling rain. John?
Well, Dan, the group of assembled dignitaries here on the platform at the Capitol building are starting to make their way back through the building. Some of them will be staying for lunch, and then the parade will begin after that as George Bush, now President Bush, makes his way back to the White House. It didn't take long for people to clear out of here. I'll tell you, Dan, that you know, some people were suggesting that this speech was a little shorter than ones that we've seen in the past, but I think people were probably glad that George Bush's inaugural address was a little shorter than the last son of a president's, which was John Quincy Adams. His speech was 40 minutes long. Judging by the weather here, the cold temperatures and the rain, I'm sure people were pretty glad that he didn't go much longer than the 14 minutes and 20 seconds that he did. Dan?
John Roberts. Let's bring in Russ Mitchell, who's been out among the crowd. Russ, enthusiastic applause at several places in the address.
That is right, Dan. The crowd was very enthusiastic. It was a highly partisan crowd. What you saw here was every time a Democrat was introduced, including now former President Clinton, he was booed. Every time a Republican was introduced, there was loud applause. In fact, one person here called this Woodstock for Republicans. I'm going to step right over here and talk to someone who saw the speech today. Hi, how are you? We're with CBS News. We're on the air live. Where are you from?
I'm from Littleton, Colorado.
What did you think about the speech?
I thought it was awesome. I am so excited to see George W. Bush in the White House. He's bringing values and ethics, and I'm pumped.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Dan, let's go back to you.
And down the Capitol steps to make their way away now, the outgoing President and First Lady, and the first Lady of the nation ever to become a senator. A ripple of applause as President George Bush, we almost said President-elect, but those days are gone forever. President George W. Bush. Handshake and a smile. A touch to the elbow, Bush to Clinton. A pat on the back for daughter Chelsea. And a handshake from Laura Bush.
Dan, you notice the helicopter standing there in the background, but I'm told because of the bad weather that the Clintons will not be helicoptering out to Andrews Air Force Base. They're going to drive out. Do you remember that dramatic moment when Ronald Reagan left the presidency? The helicopter lifted off and he asked him to fly one more time down the mall to get one more look at Washington as he said goodbye. But former President Clinton, it's a car ride to Andrews today.
President Bush will now go inside and sign the ledger that incoming presidents sign the book. The old order is gone. The new order is now taking place. In America, we have no interregnum.
We have a new president. It's as simple as that.
After saying goodbye to the Clintons, the Bushes move back inside, hand in hand. About 232 people, including the president, the vice president, their family and friends, congressional leaders, and Supreme Court justices, attend the post-inaugural lunch, which is served immediately after the swearing-in ceremony. That'll be at Statuary Hall at the Capitol. We've said this before today. We say it again. If you and the children haven't been to Statuary Hall in the Capitol, a mighty and inspirational sight. in Washington, D.C., and well worth the trip.
That's the hall, of course, Dan, where the House of Representatives at one time met, and visitors who have been to Washington will recall that that's the room where they have the statues representing two people from every state in the Union, and it's the place where you can go and hear those odd acoustics. You can stand in one corner, whisper, and it can be heard over on the other side of the hall. It's one of the most popular stops for people who come to visit the Capitol.
And no doubt President George Bush knows that in Statuary Hall, the two statues representing the state of Texas are
Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin.
You get an A in the course. You get an A in the course. Let's talk for a moment again about the inaugural address. Bob, one of my own favorite sections of this 14-minute inaugural address by President Bush, quote, "America has never been united by blood or birth or soil. We are bound by ideals that move us beyond our backgrounds, lift us above our interests, and teach us what it means to be citizens," unquote. Consistent with the theme through the whole address, that the responsibility is with individual citizens and collections of citizens every bit as much, if not more so, than the citizen-elected government.
Well, he was very much saying it can't be just the government. We've all got to get together and solve these problems. It's very much the same theme that John Kennedy talked about when he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." George Bush was saying very much the same kinds of things today, asking people to come together and underlining and emphasizing over and over, we've got to stop this partisan bickering.
Bob, two questions. He's talked the talk, and we have said, done so well here today. Beginning bright and early, by dawn's early light on Monday, he has to do the walking.
That's where the rubber hits the road, as they say, because this has all got to be done in a Congress the kind of which we have not seen in modern times. A Congress evenly split, 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats in the Senate. A Congress that has a 6-vote majority for the Republicans in the House of Representatives. The situation here, Dan, in plain language, is that you can block any program that anybody tries to introduce, but you'll have to find some kind of consensus to pass any program.
Well, how many, if any, Democrats on Capitol Hill are saying, listen, George Bush is wonderful when he talks about uniting the country and coming together, but at the same time, he's working his agenda, and as they would see it, not a mainstream agenda, as exemplified by, say, nominating John Ashcroft to be the Attorney General. How much of that is there up here on the Hill?
Well, there's a considerable amount, but I would also say that Democrats here are going to be good citizens, at least in the beginning, and for a very practical reason. They won't tell you this is the reason, but it's certainly one of the reasons. They think they have a very good chance of getting a majority in the Senate and also perhaps in the House in 2 years. So I think everything you see them do, you'll see them couch it in very good citizen kinds of terms. But it's going to be very difficult. For example, the president's tax plan. I mean, he's advocating a huge tax plan that even his own party was saying 6 months ago, we don't think you ought to go about it that way. Now, I think you're seeing more support coming for that now, but all of these things are difficult. I think the very most important thing for George Bush, Dan, is that the first initiative, whatever it is, he has to win. If he loses the first time out of the box, he may never recover.
Our CBS News coverage of the inauguration of our new president will continue after these messages, so stay here with us. Back inside the Capitol.
Mr. Chairman.
Right there with it. I have to be strong.
Listen to the talk as President Bush signs in now as the new President of the United States. This just before the lunch that will be held in Statuary Hall, which is very near where he's actually doing this signing. And as he knows from his father's time, and every incoming president has to be reminded, when you sign, it's seldom just one signature.
You know, Dan, that's Strom Thurmond right behind George Bush. He is 98 years old. And to give you an example of how young this country is, When Strom Thurmond ran for his first public office, it was for the county school board, veterans of the Civil War voted for him. Now here he stands behind the President of the United States, the 43rd President of the United States.
And the first president of the new millennium. First new president of the 21st century. You can see there the cufflinks that President George Bush the elder gave to his son. Cufflinks the son said that he had never worn before today, but wore them for this signing in. In his inaugural address, 14 minutes long, just a short while ago, several policy themes were tucked into the overarching theme of its citizens' responsibility, the number one of which being the president plugged for his large tax cut, which he promised during the campaign, saying in effect it's necessary to regain the momentum of the economy. Democrats, President Clinton lead among them, would argue that no Republican president ever presided over such a sustained boom as we've had during the Clinton-Gore years. But President Bush has another view and has said consistently that he thinks a big tax cut, new tax cut is necessary, and he said it again today. Although his Secretary of the Treasury designate did seem to put a little distance between himself and that just the other day. But there'll be plenty of time to talk about that as time goes along. The new presidency will now seek to take traction. They have lost some time in the transition with the post-election trauma that's centered around Florida. On the other hand, there's some very experienced helpers for the new president coming in, not the least of which is his father, the former president, to say nothing of Dick Cheney, his vice president. We mentioned earlier, former White House Chief of Staff, Donald Rumsfeld, who's coming back as Secretary of Defense, Colin Powell, who's no stranger to the corridors of power in the White House and elsewhere. Let's go very quickly to Gloria Borgia, who's been watching all of this and making a few phone calls around. Gloria, your reaction and comment on the inaugural address.
I think what we saw, Dan, was somebody really talking about changing the culture of Washington, but not talking about changing the direction of Washington radically. I thought back to Ronald Reagan and his revolution. This was not a revolution. This was somebody who came in to change the culture. That's what he said during the campaign, and that's what he's going to do. In addition to being unifying, as you were just saying before, Dan, he also tried, I think, in a very quiet, soft way to assert his mandate. He said education is very important to him. He said we are going to reform Medicare and Social Security. And he also, I think, in a line or two, tried to reassure foreign leaders about his foreign policy, that the United States will not retreat within its borders. The big question I have now, of course, is next week starts, he rolls out his education proposal on Capitol Hill, and I think we're all going to be looking to see whether the honeymoon is over, whether there is going to be one, or whether he's going to be able to make one of his own, because this is an issue where he knows there's a great deal of bipartisan sentiment. He may be able to get a lot of Democrats to join with him, and that would be a great, big first victory for George W. Bush.
Gloria Borgia. Our CBS News coverage of Inauguration Day in the nation's capital will roll on in just a moment. Well, back on Capitol Hill, inside the Capitol, among the papers that George W. Bush, our new president, was signing in there were the nomination papers, the confirmation of the nominations of Colin Powell to be Secretary of State, Donald Rumsfeld to be the new Defense Secretary, and Mr. O'Neill to be the new Secretary of the Treasury. All of that, Bob, is expected to be completed by today. Now, the John Ashcroft vote won't come until, it will come separately, and probably next week?
Probably the week after that. Senator Lott has said that he feels that most senators want to have some time to talk about that, and he'll give them that. You know, there is the possibility out there that Senator Ted Kennedy may filibuster the nomination of John Ashcroft. Now, that has happened. I don't think it's ever happened. It may have happened some obscure time long ago to filibuster a cabinet nomination. In the end, my guess is that won't happen, but that possibility is still out there. The others, I think, will all be confirmed with no problem.
There was other news today. Before Bill Clinton left the presidency, he pardoned 100 Americans. He also set aside another national monument area, one that will be controversial, one the Republicans will try to roll back on Governor's Island just outside, well, New York City, if you will. Set aside a national monument there, as with the other late environmental protection efforts, as he called them, that now former President Clinton made. The new president and his Republican Party will be trying to roll those back. But while we let you contemplate that news, let's go to Eric Ingberg, who's down on the street or near the street. There have been some protests and a little bit of trouble. Eric, tell us about it.
Dan, we're about 6 blocks here from the White House and from the parade route on 14th Street in Washington, right in the heart of the downtown area. And traffic is now, as you can see, moving normally again. About an hour ago, there was a fairly serious confrontation here between the police and various demonstrators in town to protest the Bush inaugural. There were a few nasty confrontations as the police pushed the demonstrators out of the streets and out of the sidewalks. What we really had was a cat and mouse situation. The protesters who didn't have a permit allowing them to legally parade tried to march down several different side streets, and every time they did so, police mobile strike forces would get out in front of them and simply block off the streets, helmeted officers with nightsticks shoving the demonstrators back if they wouldn't move, and simply cordoning them in until they agreed to retreat and go someplace else. There were about 1,000 to 1,500 protesters on this one street, which, as I say, is about 6 blocks from the parade route. At its peak, there really wasn't anything that approached a level of violence. I didn't see anybody hurt, and we didn't see anybody arrested either. The demonstrators, just for the record, Dan, represented a wide range of causes. Some of them told me they were anarchists. Others said they were simply mad about the Florida Chads. So a little bit of a cross-section of America in the protests, too.
Eric Ingberg on the streets of Washington, D.C. It was made clear by the authorities, everyone from the Secret Service right on down through the police, that the goal here today was to make sure, insofar as it could be made certain, that there was no replay of what happened in Seattle around the World Trade Organization meeting there. And law enforcement officials responsible for keeping the peace on the streets today had that very much in mind. I emphasize that one of the things that television has difficulty doing is dealing with depth. And we have the camera you saw, the police dealing with those protesters and demonstrators. Our camera is like a flashlight. We can only show you what's at the end of the beam of that camera, not on what's either side of it, what's above it or below it. There wasn't a lot of that today. In fact, I think it's probably fair to say, Bob Schieffer, check me here if you will, that there was probably less of that kind of thing here today than had been widely expected. Nobody expected riots in the streets, but there was a pretty wide expectation to be more of it than we've seen and heard of so far.
There's no question of that. I mean, the old saying in law enforcement that bad weather is the policeman's best friend, and certainly that has held down some of this, I'm sure. But this is really small potatoes. I mean, you go back to 1969 with Richard Nixon's inauguration, thousands of demonstrators down around the Washington Monument, people throwing rocks at the presidential limousine as it came by. If this is all we have, this will be a very peaceful demonstration. And I think you'll see as people begin, the Bush supporters began to come in and others come in to see the parade, I think you're going to see an overwhelming reaction for President Bush.
In 1969, and again when President Nixon was inaugurated for second term in 1973, was at the height of the anti-war protests. With that in mind, Professor, let me ask you, where is the United States of America and the beginning of the new Bush presidency at this precise historical moment?
Well, I think first off, in his speech in the inaugural address, you had President Bush now bringing Thomas Jefferson into mind. And I think he had Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt on the campaign. He had mentioned two of the presidents he most admires. Coming into the next century, I think that we're going to have to deal with a lot of the issues that he laid out on the campaign, meaning trying to get America going again, so to speak, trying to deal with what he was saying, helping the poor. He quoted, you know, about Jericho from the Bible in there, the notion that somehow the Republican Party is not indifferent to homelessness, it's not indifferent to the unemployed. Under Ronald Reagan, who many people think it was a great president, I think there seemed to be Republican indifference. Bush has been hammering that I care about people. We have to see whether his presidency will reflect that.
Interesting point you make. he had very much in mind that it's the turn of the century, as when Jefferson came to the presidency, turn of the century into the 1800s. When Theodore Roosevelt came in, we just turned the century, if you will, turn into the what became, partly because of the Theodore Roosevelt Republican presidency, reform Republican presidency, what became the American century, and now moving in toward into the first faint edges, at least, of the 21st century. Our CBS News coverage of the events surrounding this inauguration of George W. Bush as our new president will continue in just a moment. We hope you'll stay here with you. Hope you'll keep it dialed at CBS. We'll be right back. Well, back on Capitol Hill, inside the Capitol, among the papers that George W. Bush, our new president, was signing in there were the nomination papers, the confirmation of the nominations of Colin Powell to be Secretary of State, Donald Rumsfeld to be the new Defense Secretary, and Mr. O'Neill to be the new Secretary of the Treasury. All of that, Bob, is expected to be completed by today. Now, the John Ashcroft vote won't come until it will come separately, and probably next week?
Probably the week after that. Senator Lott has said that he feels that most senators want to have some time to talk about that, and he'll give them that. You know, there is the possibility out there that Senator Ted Kennedy may filibuster the nomination of John Ashcroft. Now, that has happened. I don't think it's ever happened. It may have happened some obscure time long ago to filibuster a cabinet nomination. In the end, my guess is that won't happen, but that possibility is still out there. The others, I think, will all be confirmed with no problem.
There was other news today. Before Bill Clinton left the presidency, he pardoned 100 Americans. He also set aside another national monument area, one that will be controversial, one the Republicans will try to roll back on Governor's Island just outside, well, New York City, if you will. Set aside a national monument there, as with the other late environmental protection efforts, as he called them, that now former President Clinton made. The new president and his Republican Party will be trying to roll those back. But while we let you contemplate that news, let's go to Eric Ingberg, who's down on the street or near the street. There have been some protests and a little bit of trouble. Eric, tell us about it.
Dan, we're about 6 blocks here from the White House and from the parade route on 14th Street in Washington, right in the heart of the downtown area. And traffic is now, as you can see, moving normally again. About an hour ago, there was a fairly serious confrontation here between the police and various demonstrators in town to protest the Bush inaugural. There were a few nasty confrontations as the police pushed the demonstrators out of the streets and out of the sidewalks. What we really had was a cat and mouse situation. The protesters who didn't have a permit allowing them to legally parade tried to march down several different side streets, and every time they did so, police mobile strike forces would get out in front of them and simply block off the streets, helmeted officers with nightsticks shoving the demonstrators back if they wouldn't move, and simply cordoning them in until they agreed to retreat and go someplace else. There were about 1,000 to 1,500 protesters on this one street, which, as I say, is about 6 blocks from the parade route. At its peak, there really wasn't anything that approached a level of violence. I didn't see anybody hurt, and we didn't see anybody arrested either. The demonstrators, just for the record, Dan, represented a wide range of causes. Some of them told me they were anarchists. Others said they were simply mad about the Florida Chads. So a little bit of a cross-section of America in the protests, too.
Eric Ingberg on the streets of Washington, D.C. It was made clear by the authorities, everyone from the Secret Service right on down through the police, that the goal here today was to make sure, insofar as it could be made certain, that there was no replay of what happened in Seattle around the World Trade Organization meeting there. And law enforcement officials responsible for keeping the peace on the streets today had that very much in mind. I emphasize that one of the things that television has difficulty doing is dealing with depth. And we have the camera. You saw the police dealing with those protesters and demonstrators. Our camera is like a flashlight. We can only show you what's at the end of the beam of that camera, not on what's either side of it, what's above it or below it. There wasn't a lot of that today. In fact, I think it's probably fair to say, Bob Schiefer, check me here if you will, that there was probably less of that kind of thing here today than had been widely expected. Nobody expected riots in the streets, but there was a pretty wide expectation to be more of it than we've seen and heard of so far.
There's no question of that. I mean, the old saying in law enforcement that bad weather is the policeman's best friend, and certainly that has held down some of this, I'm sure. But this is really small potatoes. I mean, you go back to 1968-9 with Richard Nixon's inauguration, thousands of demonstrators down around the Washington Monument, people throwing rocks at the presidential limousine as it came by. If this is all we have, this will be a very peaceful demonstration. And I think you'll see as people begin, the Bush supporters began to come in and others come in to see the parade, I think you're going to see an overwhelming reaction for President Bush.
In 1969, and again when President Nixon was inaugurated for second term in 1973, it was at the height of the anti-war protests. With that in mind, Professor, let me ask you, where is the United States of America and the beginning of the new Bush presidency at this precise historical moment?
Well, I think first off, in his speech in the inaugural address, you had President Bush now bringing Thomas Jefferson into mind. And I think he had Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt on the campaign. He had mentioned two of the presidents he most admires. Coming into the next century, I think that we're going to have to deal with a lot of the issues that he laid out on the campaign, meaning trying to get America going again, so to speak, trying to deal with what he was saying, helping the poor. He quoted, about Jericho from the Bible in there, the notion that somehow the Republican Party is not indifferent to homelessness, it's not indifferent to the unemployed. Under Ronald Reagan, who many people think it was a great president, I think there seemed to be Republican indifference. Bush has been hammering that I care about people. We have to see whether his presidency will reflect that.
Interesting point you make. He had very much in mind that it's the turn of the century, as when Jefferson came to the presidency, turn of the century, into the 1800s. When Theodore Roosevelt came in, we just turned the century, if you will, turned into what became, partly because of the Theodore Roosevelt Republican presidency, reform Republican presidency, what became the American century, and now moving into the first faint edges, at least, of the 21st century. Our CBS News coverage of the events surrounding this inauguration of George W. Bush as our new president will continue in just a moment. We hope you'll stay here with you. Hope you'll keep it dialed at CBS. We'll be right back.
CBS News presidential inauguration coverage continues. From Capitol Hill, here again is Dan Rather.
Good day again, and it is a good day, a celebration day, as America celebrates the peaceful transfer of power from Bill Clinton to George Bush. We have a new president and a new vice president. George W. Bush and Dick Cheney both now have been sworn in about an hour ago, right back there at the U.S. Capitol. Our CBS News Chief White House correspondent John Roberts is down at the west front of the Capitol. John?
Dan, certainly a peaceful transition of power, but nobody can deny that it was a real battle to try to get here. Let's not forget the 36 days after the November 7th election when things were going back and forth over the vote in Florida. But all in all today, I think it was really an exercise in, as George Bush said, civility and certainly grace on the part of Vice President Al Gore, who sat there and in a very collegial fashion and appreciative fashion watched that transition of power. I think that in the inaugural address, I was struck by the number of times that George Bush mentioned the word education in some form or another. Certainly his tax cut and prescription drugs are legislative items that he plans on putting high up on his agenda, but his top priority is going to be education. It will be the first bill that he will introduce here in Congress. That'll come on Tuesday, a $47.6 billion initiative that would teach every child to read by the 3rd grade and would provide $1,500 in vouchers for private school to parents of children whose schools don't make the grade after 3 years of really rigorous and tough examination. President Bush plans on making the entire next week Education Week, Dan, but it's not all he's doing. He's got some executive orders that he's going to issue today, and he's also going to be meeting with members of Congress next week. In particular, one interesting meeting will occur on Wednesday night when he meets with Senator John McCain about campaign finance reform. Dan?
John Robertson, footnote, if, as John Roberts reported, it now appears it's going to be the case that President Bush is going to send to Congress an education bill that includes vouchers, which is a rough translation of vouchers is additional federal money going to private schools. That will engender at least some fight from Democrats and perhaps some Republicans on Capitol Hill. There have been any number of Republicans, by no means a majority, I'm not suggesting that, who've suggested to President Bush that he doesn't want to start because vouchers are controversial. The whole business of private schools versus public schools comes into play. So there have been some in his own party urging him not to send up an education bill emphasizing money for the so-called voucher program. But from all indications, he is going ahead with that, going to make education his first priority, and a voucher program, which has been fundamental to Republican campaigns for quite a little while now, will apparently be an integral part of that. Now, the photographs you just saw a moment ago, those pictures were of President Clinton out at Andrews Air Force Base. He'd hoped a helicopter out there. The weather wouldn't allow that, so they motorcaded out to Andrews Air Force Base, from where President Clinton will take his ride, his final ride, one wants to say, as a recent president, a former president, aboard Air Force One. I wouldn't want to say it's the last time he boards Air Force One. He may fly it again as a guest of some future president. But it'll be a nostalgic trip for him where he goes to New York, and in New York, a crowd of Democrats is gathering to greet him and to welcome him to New York, where the president is going to have offices. And we say he's going to have offices. He's going to have his own offices in New York, separate and apart from Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton's offices in New York. We also want to mention to you, and we'll follow up on this a little bit later on, that the president today pardoned, President Clinton, as he went out today, pardoned more than 100 Americans, and that included former Whitewater business partner Susan McDougal, who stood in prison for so long, refusing to testify against the president, his brother Roger Clinton, and former CIA director John Deutsch. All of those are going to be, have been pardoned. There's a fairly long list here. But among those that the president did not pardon today, Webster Hubbell, a former law partner of Hillary Rodham Clinton, Jonathan Pollard, a former Navy analyst imprisoned for spying for Israel. Been a lot of pressure on the president to pardon him. He did not do it. And one-time Wall Street financier, Michael Milken, while there was some reports circulating last night that the president was going to pardon Milken, he did not do so. He also did not pardon Leonard Peltier, convicted of killing 2 FBI agents on an Indian reservation in 1975. So the president pardoned more than 100 Americans today. Now, the new president and his wife entering to applause Statuary Hall inside the Capitol. And for the first time as president, hearing Hail to the Chief played for him. He'll hear it played more robustly when they get the full Marine or U.S. Army band, but this being indoors, a much smaller group playing that.
Dan, remember, Jimmy Carter didn't want Hail to the Chief played. He didn't want the ruffles and flourishes and all of that. He thought there was too much majesty and ceremony about the president. They stopped it for a while, and people just didn't like it. They wanted it to be heard, and so they started it back.
True enough, and one wonders whether George Washington would like it, because Washington was against pomposity in the presidency. They're going to have a meal here inside Statuary Hall. But there's been an ongoing debate since the very beginnings of the United States of America as a constitutional republic, as to how the presidency should be carried on. Washington felt so strongly in not making it in any way, shape, or form like the monarchy. He wanted it pretty well, you know, along the lines of, look, I'm just another citizen.
Well, Thomas Jefferson felt even more strongly about that, and all of the founding fathers. They were so afraid that they would replace this monarchy that they had just gotten rid of with some kind of new monarchy. They didn't want their revolution to end up like the French Revolution did, and so there was even a great debate over what to call the president. At one point they were talking about calling him Your Royal Highness or Your Presidential Highness. Finally they just settled on the president.
Well, Bob, so you and I can both go back to Texas. I'm going to ask the director to go back inside Statuary Hall, pick up the last strains of The Eyes of Texas Are Upon You. As we take a break, our CBS coverage of the inauguration will return in just a moment. As our continuing coverage of CBS Inauguration Day event goes on, we're going to take you to Andrews Air Force Base, where a farewell is being given to now former President Bill Clinton. It will include a 21-gun salute. This is at Hangar 6 at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland, just outside the nation's capital. And in this nondescript airplane hangar, the hostages returned from Iran, bodies of brave American servicemen and women killed in the line of duty have been brought back through here. Memorable moments in this hangar, and one taking place right now with the outgoing president, now former President Bill Clinton, being saluted as he leaves.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 42nd President of the United States, William Jefferson Clinton, accompanied by Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton, Chelsea Clinton, General Jim Hawkins, and Linda Hawkins.
One of the things he will notice right away is no more hail to the chief.
But it is rather interesting, Dan, in that you're talking about all the ceremonies that were held here. I can never recall a former president having a farewell ceremony here. They usually left Inauguration Day to the man who was just inaugurated and went on about their business.
I'm not sure. I think when President Reagan left, they had something similar. We'd have to double check that. Let's go to Bill Plant, who covered the Reagan administration, as he has over the years covered so many presidents, who is at this ceremony. Bill?
Well, Dan, President Reagan had a going-away ceremony. It was outdoors. This one would have been too, but for the weather. It was perhaps as elaborate, it's hard to remember, but they're letting President Clinton down easy. He has a full military band. He still gets ruffles and flourishes. You can hear it behind me. But, of course, no more hail to the chief. Here comes the 21-gun salute, and this hangar is filled with former somebody or others. Cabinet secretaries, assistant cabinet secretary, all the way down to the level of advanced person. They're here to send off the man who they worked so hard for over the past 8 years, Bill Clinton. He, of course, is not going quietly. He never would have. He was very busy on his last day in office, issuing pardons, naming a new national monument, and then greeting his successor for coffee. Mr. Clinton will go from here to New York City. He'll land in JFK Airport in the big presidential 747, tail number 28,000. But it won't be called Air Force One anymore. It'll be called Special Air Mission 28,000. And he'll go on up to the new Clinton home in Chappaqua. And of course, he'll be back probably pretty soon. Who knows? Maybe by Monday. We don't know for sure. But Bill Clinton isn't really going away. And that may turn out at some point or another to be a thorn in the side of the new president, George W. Bush. Here's the national anthem.
Andrews Air Force Base, the farewell to President Clinton from Washington, D.C. Bob Schieffer.
Well, I just want to say I stand corrected. Obviously, there were ceremonies for former President Reagan. I just had a little senior moment there. I just simply forgot.
Listen, in 5.5 hours of live broadcasting, we'll forgive you more than once. But it's become something of a ritual saying goodbye to presidents in this way. As we said, President Reagan flew up a helicopter. He intended to do that with outgoing President Clinton today, but the weather wouldn't permit it, so he motorcaded out to Andrews Air Force Base. Now, George Bush, the new president, and his wife, along with the new Vice President Dick Cheney and Mrs. Cheney, they're inside Statuary Hall in the Capitol at this moment having lunch. We'll be back with more about that and some of the other events of the day in just a moment, but right now we'll take this short break. Well, back at our CBS News inaugural day coverage booth, high atop the Capitol grounds, looking back on the beautiful west front of the Capitol. The events have moved along pretty much on schedule, although George W. Bush was sworn in a couple of minutes past noon when the scheduled call for him to be sworn in at precisely at high noon. But things have gone pretty much as scheduled, and the weather, which was expected to be a factor in its foulness, has held off. The snows may yet be coming, or hard rain or sleet tonight to make it more difficult to get to inaugural balls, but the main event of the day has gone off without a hitch, very smoothly. An excellent inaugural address, delivered well by the new president, and so for the moment at least, and let us pray continues, all's well. Let's go to Phil Jones, who is covering along the parade route. Phil, you've covered these inaugurations, I know, since at least the early 1970s, I think the late 1960s. Talk about this one. Help put us in perspective for people.
Dan, I came to Washington in 1973. I was here in time for Richard Nixon's second inaugural parade. And I remember the tensions at the time. It was in the Vietnam War period, and there were protesters all over town as President Nixon made his way to the White House. There were things thrown, cans and tomatoes and all sorts of fruit thrown at his motorcade. And I think that the police here in Washington, D.C. were ready for something like this to happen this time. They had been told that there might be up to 20,000 protesters. I think last count, I figured we have roughly 10,000 law enforcement people throughout this city ready for the protesters. But for some reason, so far, it hasn't really materialized as far as any trouble. Eric Engberg reported earlier about a couple of incidents, but right here, which was to be the center for all of the protests, there were at least 10 organizations that had permits to be here. I really haven't seen much. I've seen them all come. I would judge we probably have 500 or 600 protesters here at the time. They're here for all sorts of different things, but right now it's going off very well, and it's much calmer than I really expected.
Phil Jones, and it's worth noting that there's nothing illegal about demonstrating or protesting. It's a right guaranteed to Americans in our precious Bill of Rights. It's when protesters or demonstrators or dissenters become violent that law enforcement is supposed to move in, and of course it is within the law with certain very strict limitations for law enforcement to try to prevent law breaking. So that may be worth noting as we talk about protesters and dissenters and demonstrators. In America, you can protest, you can dissent, and yes, you can demonstrate, as long as you do so peacefully and within the law. Dateline Jerusalem, Israel accepts a Palestinian proposal for marathon peace talks in Egypt. This just in from Jerusalem, an Associated Press alert, I repeat, Israel accepts a Palestinian proposal for marathon peace talks in Egypt. So when it comes to foreign policy, our new president, George W. Bush's work is cut out for him very quickly. Now, Bob Schieffer, this will no doubt fill our newspapers, perhaps the back pages, but fill our newspapers and magazines the next few weeks. Well, all right, George Bush is going to have to, in some ways, engage or disengage from the Middle East peace process. He doesn't have time to mull that decision very long. He's got to make a decision. and with Colin Powell, in effect, agreeing with the incoming president that, look, maybe the United States needs to do a little bit less overseas. We're going to be engaged right away in a foreign policy debate.
Well, absolutely. Every president for the last, 40 years has been deeply involved in trying to bring some sort of closure and some sort of peace to the Middle East. George Bush will be no different. This will be a problem that he'll have to deal with, obviously, from the very beginning of his administration. And it won't be easy, because it never has been. All the easy problems, Dan, have already been solved.
Doug Brinkley, we have only some seconds here, but let's talk about what happens to former presidents, those who leave office and still living. With Bill Clinton, we have now a former president who's still pretty young at, what, age 54 years old?
Yes, that's right. Well, they do many different things. Herbert Hoover used to call them an exclusive trade union ex-presidents. There aren't many of them, although we have 5 alive today doing various things. But Bill Clinton's, I think, going to follow the model of being politically active. You know, it's something that's been bothering me recently is people keep acting like Bill Clinton's the only president that wants to stay in Washington. Well, John Quincy Adams lost the White House, and he came back and served 16 years in Congress. Andrew Johnson was impeached, and he came back as a U.S. Senator from Tennessee. People like Grover Cleveland lost the presidency and then came back for a second term. William Howard Taft came back to be Supreme Court Justice. And then even people like Herbert Hoover was constantly coming in and out of Washington, running different commissions. And Jimmy Carter, our ultimate ex-president, who Bill Clinton says he's going to model himself after, is globetrotting and going all over the world. The Middle East situation, which Bill Clinton worked so hard on, don't be surprised if we see Bill Clinton trying to be what they call track 2 diplomacy or third-party mediation, going back to places like the Middle East or Northern Ireland, where he spent so much of his precious presidential time fighting for peace.
And I, for one, this is obviously a personal opinion, would not be surprised, I certainly would not be stunned, I wouldn't even be surprised to see Bill Clinton run for something again. Senator, congressman, when I interviewed him just before Christmas, he even joked about the possibility of running for mayor of New York. I'm not to say that I think he will do that, but just to say he's going to take a little time to decompress and decide what he wants to do, but no one should be very surprised if he decides to run for something. Now, I'll have some closing thoughts in a moment, but before that, we put together some of the sights and sounds of the day here in Washington. Take a look and listen.
Well, I want to talk about how optimistic I am about America, what a wonderful country this is. I'm also going to say that some people don't really see the American dream as meant for them.
This is really a celebration of democracy, and it's even for Democrats, it's a time when we recognize what a special country this really is.
The President-elect of the United States, George Walker Bush.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States. Today we affirm a new commitment to live out our nation's promise through civility, courage, compassion, and character. Sometimes our differences run so deep, it seems we share a continent, but not a country. We do not accept this, and we will not allow it. And this is my solemn pledge. I will work to build a single nation of justice and opportunity. I ask you to be citizens. Citizens, not spectators. Citizens, not subjects. Responsible citizens, building communities of service and a nation of character.
It has been 200 years since the first inauguration day here in Washington, D.C. Previous inaugurations were held in New York and Philadelphia. Thomas Jefferson took the oath in a Capitol still under construction at that time. That magnificent dome was still years away. Jefferson could not have imagined what this city, this world, had become. A world in which presidents fly through the sky and their fellow Americans go into space. Perhaps as amazing as that, in this age of high technology and high science, is the durability of a document, handwritten more than 2 centuries ago, which, for the 42nd time, has produced an orderly, peaceful transfer of presidential power, the United States Constitution. In the days before George Washington first assumed that power, Congress debated how to address the leader of the infant nation. Someone suggested excellency, another his highness, someone else his mightiness. It was decided he'd be addressed simply as Mr. President, acknowledgement he was not a sovereign, but a servant of the people from whom his power was derived. Now that power falls to George Bush. Long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light. Dan Rather, good day.